Hey, there's my friend Mekong Institute. How are you doing? Welcome, Malaysia. Department of. Hey, there's my friend Mekong Institute. Good morning from Bangladesh and the Philippine Plant Food Unit. Now that YouTube live stream is on, and you can see in the chat box the link, and then this is going to be the link for the recorded webinar. You are free to share this link to anyone that you know that who might not have been registered to the Zoom meeting, but then the people can watch with a slight delay, 30 seconds delay. So go ahead and then share the YouTube channel. You might want to tweet, you might want to share on the Facebook or whatever that you would like to do. You can just share the link to anyone who might be interested in this conference. As you can see on the screen, an email will be sent to all the attendees with the link to a generic certificate. So if you need a certificate, just wait. If you're registered and if you attended, you will get the email from all of us to get the generic certificate. So don't worry too much about this. Good morning from Vietnam. Ooh, we have PNG, the Papua New Guinea. Very welcome. Good morning, good afternoon there. Please make sure to choose all panelists and attendees from the two fields in the chat box so that everybody can see your comment. If you choose only all panelists, then you may not be able to send your comments to all the attendees. That right now that we are close to 300 people coming on to the Zoom webinar. Welcome from Sri Lanka and the Philippines. Nice to be meeting you all. Thank you very much for introducing yourself. It'd be fun to see the familiar names in the chat box. Please introduce yourself. Make sure to select all panelists and attendees when you send a comment. We would love to know where you are connecting from. Good morning from Malaysia. Good morning to Fiji. Welcome to the conference. Choose all panelists and attendees from the two fields so that everybody can see your comments. Another person from PNG, welcome. Yes, that's a colleague. Thank you very much for connecting. Hello, Sri Lanka. Hello, Malaysia. We have industry colleagues and NGOs. Very welcome to the conference. Hello, Livestock Department, Thailand. And Singapore Food Agency, welcome. India and researchers from Brazil, welcome to the conference. Okay, now that we have about 300 people connecting from everywhere in the region, also outside of the region, I would like to give you a quick overview of the webinar, the function. If you mouse over your screen, you will see two menus on the bottom. One says Q&A, another says chat. So right now I am asking you to use the chat function to introduce yourself and then introduce your country or whatever you would like to greet other fellow participants. It's free to use. You can write anything in the chat box. But then during the conference, we will specifically ask you to use the Q&A box. In the Q&A box, if you click on, there will be a window, and then not yet, don't use the Q&A box yet, but then here that you can start writing questions once we have started the session. So once we start the session, panelists will talk and then you can write the question. But then when you write the question, please make sure to write the name to ask the questions to which panelist that you would like to ask question to. So for example, that we will have the first speakers is Bob Baker, the Mr. Bob Baker. You can ask Bob, I have a question, and then it's easier for all of us to understand that what question is addressed to whom. So please make sure to use this question box to write your question, and then make sure that you address the name that you are questioning to. So that is the Q&A box, and then once your question is answered, you will be notified in the box, and then the question will be stored in the answered box. So make sure to use the Q&A box when the session starts. So not yet, not yet use the question box yet. You can use the chat box to greet to all of us, but then at this moment that the question Q&A box, not yet. Let's use the Q&A box once that we start the session, please. Important thing about Q&A box is that during the session, we won't be able to monitor the chat box to answer your question. So if there is a question to the speakers, please make sure to use the Q&A box, not the chat box. Right now, use the chat box, please. So I hope that is clear. Now that we may receive lots of questions in the Q&A box, in that case that we may not be able to address all the questions during the session because of the time limitation. In that case, don't worry, we will make sure to answer all the valid questions in the Q&A box in the final report. So once FAO publishes the final report, you will see the answers to your written questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat box, but in Q&A box. So don't worry, write your questions. It's better, many more, the merrier. So write your question, whatever the question on the food safety topic is okay. But then if your question is not about food safety, it is very difficult for us to answer your questions. So don't ask any other questions than something related to food safety. Thank you very much. Okay, so now we have so many people from Philippines, and then somebody is writing Sawadika, so that is Thai greetings. We see Sri Lanka, we see Mindanao, Philippines. We see researchers and lecturers. Very good. Welcome. Make sure to choose all panelists and attendees in the to field when you type the greetings in the comment chat box so that everybody can see your comment. If you select only all panelists, then only few people can see your comments. So write down your name and then where you're connecting in the chat box, but then select all panelists and attendees, please. Then everybody can see your comments. Okay. Now, I would like to show everybody a video of food safety issues coming from their country of Singapore. And then once the Singapore video is over, then we will be able to officially start the conference day 2. So as soon as we are ready to show the Singapore video, you will be able to watch on the screen. And then after the video, we will start the webinar.
Ensuring food safety is important for all countries, including Singapore. Ensuring safe food for all gives confidence to our people that the food they buy is safe to eat. To do so, Singapore put in place an effective integrated food safety system from farm to fork, including robust regulatory controls. This system is guided by science-based risk assessment and is consistent with international standards. Because we import over 90% of our food, we work closely with other countries as well as international bodies such as FAO and Codex to ensure the safety of our food. However, ensuring food safety is not the work of the government alone. Food safety is a joint responsibility. It is important that our food industry and consumers play their part to ensure that the food we eat in Singapore is safe. Singapore has made significant strides in food safety in the past decades. One area we are very proud of is our hawker food. Singapore is known as a food heaven. We have a diverse range of affordable and delicious hawker food being sold in clean, modern hawker centers. However, this was not always the case. It took determined efforts by the government in the 1970s and over a period of 10 years to relocate street hawkers into purpose-built buildings which provided access to amenities such as clean water, electricity, and drainage. These hawker centers have allowed our hawkers to operate rain or shine while maintaining good hygiene standards. Today, there are more than 110 hawker centers providing our people with safe and affordable food. A more recent example would be the formation of a central authority, which is the Singapore Food Agency. It consolidates regulatory oversights from 3 different ministries. This allows us to holistically manage the food industry and the food safety from farm to fork in Singapore. Singapore and FAO enjoy a good relationship. Under our MOU, we have collaborated on initiatives to improve food safety and address antimicrobial resistance in the region. For example, we work together with FAO's Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific to develop an FAO tool to assess the capacities of countries to detect and monitor antimicrobial residues. FAO has also been active in rolling out food safety capability building programs. For example, we found the regional workshop on developing national food safety indicators useful and very important. We support the FAO's very important efforts to continue its good work in rolling out food-related programs for the benefit of the international community.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone from the FAO Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific here in Bangkok. Let me first thank you all again for joining in such big numbers, both on this Zoom call as well as on YouTube. It just shows how pertinent are the issues that we've been discussing here. And we started 2 days ago, and we will continue today. As we said in the first session on Tuesday, we are holding this conference in 4 parts. On Tuesday, we covered food control systems and the role primarily of governments, but how they actually partner with the private sector and consumers to ensure food control across the chain. And today we will talk more about science and how it underpins food safety. Next Tuesday, we will talk about standards, about trade, and the role of smallholders in good practices. And on day 4, which will be the Thursday next week, we will talk about misinformation in food safety and the very important topic of capacity building for the future. We will start today. First, we'll just do a brief overview on what we discussed 2 days ago. You will, and this will also help some of the new participants who are joining today and who may not have had the chance to take part on Tuesday. Let me also say that we have all the recordings on YouTube, so you can go back and watch the entire proceedings from start to finish. And it might even answer some of the questions that we've actually seen already being asked in either the chat or the Q&A. So that might actually have a very lot of information for you already to start with. What we did a couple of days ago is that we focused on food control, the elements of food control, and what are the underpinnings or the building blocks of food safety across the food chain in many countries. So we started with a keynote presentation by Alan Riley, who from his experience is the former or the retired chief executive officer of food safety in Ireland, who described the elements, what are the roles that they play, and importantly, he talked about the challenges that COVID-19 has placed before food control authorities. And the irony, of course, is that COVID-19 is not a food safety issue. It is not known to be transmitted by food or by or related to it. But the context in which the foods and agriculture sector operates right now, as COVID is all worldwide and globally widespread, it does influence how food safety is actually practiced. So there are disruptions, and therefore competent authorities and food control agencies have to come up with strategies to ensure that they can keep up the regulation. Because some of the measures that are used for COVID-19, such as social distancing, such as the use of PPE, such as lockdowns and restrictions on movement, do affect the movements of food safety regulators. They cannot go out for regular inspections as they could earlier, or the laboratories can't analyze as many samples as they would have done earlier. So these are challenges that our food control authorities are grappling with. And at the same time, they have to preserve the integrity of the food chain all through. And importantly, as we see from all the questions that keep coming, communication with all the consumers to ensure, to allay their concerns, to ensure that nobody is left, goes hungry, or nobody denies himself or herself the nutrition that they and their families need purely because of concerns which may not have scientific basis. So these were some of the issues that Alan talked about in the first keynote. This was followed by some very interesting presentations where we looked at countries in the region. So we started with Bangladesh, which is a very special example given its large population and its very high density of population. It has more than 1,000 people per square kilometer. So the challenges with the food chain and the food system are very, very tough. And therefore, food control authorities have to be doubly sure at every step on the safety and of the food that is for human consumption. So here we talked more about the food chain, about implementing the food chain approach, about the transition that the country has undergone over the last 7 years when they enacted the new food safety law, set up a single agency for food safety called the Food Safety Authority, and have put in mechanisms to coordinate with all the ministries and agencies, and there are more than 20 of them, to coordinate on food control along the chain with sectors, as well as then partner with the private industry and with consumers. They also, here, the presenter, Shah Mahfouzur Rahman, also talked about the advances that have been made in setting up laboratory networks, including private laboratories, which can actually then have analyzed a number of samples. He also talked about partnership with the civil society, because a country with such a large population needs the civil society to participate. Otherwise, it becomes very difficult to implement. We then had cases, one from, of course, what is a role model, Australia and New Zealand. So Lisa Szabo talked about the bilateral food control, which is practiced between Australia and New Zealand. And she actually brought in also a regional perspective by talking about how it's actually implemented in New South Wales, and how they're actually tackling certain issues such as salmonellosis in that particular state. So of course, Australia and New Zealand present in many ways an ideal model, which Asian and Pacific countries can aspire to, but at the same time contextualize it to their countries. And that contextualization was provided when Myanmar and Nepal, where we again had two speakers, Dr. Sabai Hettu and Dr. Mohan Krishnan Mahajan, who talked about the changes in their legislation, in the way that they were enacting formulating their new regulations, and bringing more partnership into the chain. In case of Myanmar, there was also a reference to a very interesting study on the presence of dyes, non-permitted dyes in food, which is in fact something which aroused a lot of questions from the participants. And Nepal talked about the implementation of GAP, or good agriculture practices, among smallholder farmers, which is actually in many ways a way to demonstrate that food safety has business benefits and that farmers benefit, and that's why it becomes in their interest to adopt better food safety practices. So having discussed all this on Tuesday, today we are here to talk about what underpins all this, and that's science. And science provides evidence and data for food safety. If we know that some of the risks in food include aflatoxins, salmonella, heavy metals, pesticides, veterinary drugs, it's because of the evidence that is generated through scientific studies on their presence and the potential exposure of human populations to these hazards, which then become risks to human health. And therefore, today's session will focus on these hazards and risks. In fact, essentially the methodologies that are used to find how these risks, how these hazards become risks, and what are their entry points and what are their routes. And we have two very distinguished keynote speakers who will talk about that. The information that they generate, evidence and data, is important for the setting of regulations, for standards, and many of you who are in this meeting right now are probably frequent participants in Codex meetings, which is the FAO-WHO International Food Standard Setting platform, where all the information is brought about, the evidence and data is brought together, and then these standards are set. Many of you are also probably part of ad hoc task forces, which discuss very important issues. One of them is antimicrobial resistance. We are all in the middle of the World Antimicrobial Resistance Week, so I'm sure that is a very pertinent topic to link here as well. And then all this is aided by technology, because technology provides us tools, instruments, sophisticated instrumentation that we all use to synthesize data on hazards and risks. So with that, at this point, this is what we will talk about today. And we have very distinguished speakers at this point, and we will then start the proceedings shortly. And here with that background, I'd like first to invite Bob Baker, who is the Corporate Food Safety Science and Capabilities Director of Mars Incorporated. I don't think Mars needs any introduction to anybody, whether it doesn't matter what age you are, everybody knows Mars and what it manufactures. So I'm sure we are in for a very tasty presentation. And what Bob actually does, he leads the initiatives on corporate science strategy, especially in the area of microbial risk management and mycotoxin risk management and food integrity, and provides leadership and support to various corporate partnerships. So with that, I hand it over to Bob. Over to you, Bob, and welcome to the conference.
Hi there, can everyone hear me? Hello? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you, Bob.
Okay, so in here, let's see here, start my video. Trying to get technology to work here, guys. Firstly, thank you for the wonderful introduction. My name's Bob Baker, as mentioned, work for Mars Incorporated. Firstly, would like to thank FAO and the organizing team for this this wonderful invitation to join this webinar today. And I feel honored and privileged to be able to share this information with you over the course of the next 15 minutes. Can we go to the next slide, please? So just to give you a little bit of a background about Mars, and as mentioned, you probably know a lot of our products, but just to kind of give a little bit of the detail is, Mars is a privately owned company owned by the Mars family, based out of McLean, Virginia in the US. We operate in over 80 countries and with net sales in excess of 35 billion annually. We have 454 sites globally with 2,500, greater than 2,500 veterinary hospitals. Just a point of interest is that Mars is one of the largest employer of veterinarians in the world, as part of our veterinary practices. We have $10 billion brands, and we have greater than 130,000 associates globally. So you can imagine having that large of an associate base. You need a guiding light or a due north. So really, we are united and guided by what we call the 5 principles of Mars, being quality, responsibility, mutuality, efficiency, and freedom, of which really become our corporate philosophy, our corporate guiding light, our due north. Next slide, please. One thing that's of interest and where food safety fits in is really a big part of our sustainability and a generation plan. At Mars, we know that the world we want starts with how we do business today. The world is facing significant challenges. Poverty, water stress, climate change, and other social environmental issues are holding back the potential of people, communities, and business. At Mars, we believe it's time to take a new approach to addressing these challenges, an approach that takes what we've learned during the last decade by focusing on the impacts of our direct operations and expands our ambitions to our entire value chain to make a significant impact. It's time to embrace a sense of urgency. That's why we've launched our Sustainable in a Generation plan, of which food safety and food safety science are an integral part. This is a plan that will grow in ways that are good for people, good for the planet, and good for our business. Mars has long believed our business will thrive and endure for generations to come only if the people we work with, from farmers who produce our raw materials, through to our associates, customers, and consumers, and that they thrive as well. And none of us will thrive without a healthy planet. A win-win approach is the DNA of our company and was first expressed more than 70 years ago by Forrest Mars Sr. when he described the objective of our company as creating mutual benefits for all our stakeholders through the manufacturing and distribution of our products. We're combining our business principles with science, and a lot of that in the area of food safety, to guide us in shaping a plan within which Mars can grow while operating within planetary boundaries and delivering positive social impact. Next slide, please. And a big part of that, and many of you have probably seen this slide over the course of the webinars, but also over the course of the years, is, a big part of it is food security. And food security is not possible without food safety. So if there's not food safety, there isn't food security. And I think that's a a big piece to take away from this. Next slide, please. So in terms of what does this mean for Mars, just to kind of give a feel for the magnitude, we routinely on an annual basis utilize about 6.8 million tons of raw materials. These boxes are of different size just to kind of give a feel for the magnitude of each of the commodities. And as you can see, many of these commodities can pose challenges when sourcing on a global basis. And it really goes to the importance of really understanding the value streams of each of these, understanding the hazards, but also understanding how those hazards turn to risks and what's needed to manage them, along with having the right science, understanding, and control systems in place to manage those risks going forward. Next slide, please. So if you think about it, there's no dispute that food safety of foods we consume influences nutrition, health, and well-being of individuals. Unsafe foods have a debilitating human, economic, and social consequence. Despite what the world knows about the importance of food safety, 1 in 10 people on our planet suffers from eating unsafe foods. Approximately 4.5 billion people a year are exposed to mycotoxins, which include aflatoxin, coming from agricultural crops and contaminate 25% of the world's food supply, resulting in 600 million to 1 billion in lost earnings. We must be vigilant about food safety along our value chain, starting with agricultural production, harvesting, post-harvest handling, storage, and transportation, extending to processing, packaging, storage, and distribution within the manufacturing sector, and including the end users, consumers, and how they store, handle, and consume food products. Our goal through innovation, collaboration, and world-class control practices is to combat the causes of unsafe food around the world. So to that end, what our action has been is we've opened a global food safety center, the Mars Global Food Safety Center, which is in Huairou, China. The center actually opened a little over 5 years ago and is a global hub and state-of-the-art research and training facility designed to drive a global focus on addressing food safety challenges through partnerships and collaborations on a pre-competitive basis. The center serves as a platform and catalyst to build partnerships with governments, academia, non-government organizations, and industry stakeholders as we work together to ensure safer food for all. Food safety is an essential and dynamic element of food security, as I mentioned before, with new threats emerging that require urgent action by developed and developing countries. The bottom line, if it isn't safe, it isn't food. So next slide, please. So I had mentioned the pre-competitive nature of food safety. We at Mars believe that food safety is pre-competitive and is actually fertile grounds of which industry, of which government, of which academia can come together and work on some of the challenges that are facing the world's food supplies today. It's not an area of which should be used to drive a competitive advantage by any of industry or other groups. So really, it's an area that, in terms of research, we can collaborate in terms of looking at where the challenges are, sharing best practice and findings on research, promoting an exchange of learnings and leveraging some knowledge and how that's used, and really how we extend those capabilities out into global practice. Next slide, please. So if you look at it in terms of what we're doing, in terms of our main priority areas at the Food Safety Center, we've actually honed it down into 3 strategic research areas. One being around mycotoxins and looking at mycotoxin risk management. This has mainly been focused around aflatoxin and really better understanding what's needed to prevent the formation of aflatoxin. But also then what's needed to be done once materials are actually contaminated. This also includes some collaborative work we've done in terms of developing some risk prediction models, looking at a number of agricultural practices and climatic conditions. Another area that we're looking at, strategic areas around microbial risk management, and really looking at how do we get better at detecting, confirming, but also understanding the true genesis of contamination. And a big piece of this area is really looking at genomics and metagenomics as the keys to better understanding really the root cause of contaminants, but really more importantly is how do we prevent them in the future? And that's the ultimate goal in that area. And the last area is around food integrity, and a lot of that's around food fraud and how do we best manage the safety of food from food fraud, but also looking at other contaminants and ensuring the wholesomeness and quality and safety of materials. And a lot of that's been focused on looking at tools in terms of methods, but also in terms of surveillance tools and collaboration in terms of horizon scanning. And how do we better know what we don't know and be prepared for that now going forward? Next slide, please. So where this all comes together, and it's what we call the quality and food safety domino effect. We believe that if you take science and understanding and you use that and apply it to one food safety issue, that in turn can impact the supply chain. That in turn could have further implications in an industry. And at the end of the day, you could have actually raised the bar on societal impact through innovations that impact food security. We believe the model can be implemented in any market because it operates on the same standard globally, which is really quality for all. It also allows us to test the networks, leverage data, and learn from the experience generated at each location and context. It helps us to continuously test the system, adapt and evolve and improve risk management and standardization. It creates agility throughout the global network and builds trust from which that can go further to societal impacts. Next slide, please. So really to kind of bring it all home, we believe that we all have an opportunity to transform food safety through collaboration. Not any one entity can address food safety. It's basically an area where collaboration is needed. I almost look at food safety as a team sport, of which, if you get the right players coming together, you could have wonderful outcomes. And it's an area where industry, regulators, academias can come together, share expertise, share best practice, share learnings, and really start to make a difference and raise the bar on food safety globally. And it's also an area where we can actually make a difference. We need to start somewhere. So anyway, going to the next slide, please. With that, I'd like to say thank you and entertain any questions there may be. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bob, for a very interesting presentation. Thank you so much. Before starting taking the questions from the participants, I would like to inform you housekeeping announcement. Basically, there is an optimal view that you can set from your desktop. If you go to the upper right corner of the Zoom screen, you can select side-by-side gallery view. That will be the best situation. You can see the slide very well, and then also the speaker very well. So may I suggest everybody to choose the view so that it would be really interesting to see the interactive session of the Zoom presentation. Another housekeeping, but then right now that the Q&A box is active, so please start typing your questions if you have any. And then the first speaker, the keynote speaker, his name is Bob Baker. So he is very happy to be addressed to as Bob. So if you write your question, dear Bob, can you answer this question? And then I will try to pick some questions from from participants. So use the Q&A box. So Bob, are you ready to answer some of the questions that I have found? The first question is that very philosophical question that you can answer in your personal the point of view. The one person is saying, how safe is the food we are eating, especially in the wake of COVID-19? That is very philosophical, but then can you tell us your insights or any view from your point of view? Over to you, Bob.
Yeah, and that's a great question, and you know, I can talk to that question from my perspective. I believe, you know, a lot of it comes down to, you know, do we believe that COVID has had a significant impact on food supply itself? Looking at what we at Mars have done is we have global quality systems, and we have global standards that we have in place. So we've actually, those standards stay the same whether it's with COVID or without COVID. And the approaches, what may change is our approach to delivering those standards, but not necessarily the quality standards. So, you know, so what we would do, and I heard it mentioned about, you know, looking at suppliers and supplier audits. Typically, you know, if you look at it, we have a risk-based quality management system, and our higher risk suppliers would have, you know, more frequent visits and more frequent audits face to face. What we've had to do there is actually use some, you know, the likes of GFSI and GFSI approvals throughout some of our auditing. We've used technology to do face-to-face audits, albeit over a computer screen. We've also used third-party auditors to help in some areas, you know, depending on where it is. So at the end of the day, the way we're approaching it is that our standards are the same, our approach to quality is the same, but it's just where we've made some subtle differences to account for COVID. But speaking for other companies or what have you, I feel a little bit hesitant to say that at this point. I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Thank you very much, Bob. Sorry, that another question is that how is real-time surveillance and monitoring taking place in Mars for identifying risk evidence? So that's a very interesting question. I understand this is more like how the real-time surveillance data collection is happening. So it's a big question, but then okay, go ahead, please.
Yeah, and you know, it's interesting because, you know, real time is looking at what's happening, but also there needs to be a historical perspective built into it. So I'll use an example of real time monitoring, and we've developed some tools, or actually a tool to look at aflatoxin formation in corn, and we use it as a barometer to assess whether a corn crop anywhere in the world has a specific risk of production of aflatoxin. We use that as a benchmark against previous years, but also against the benchmark against what we've seen potentially as being the worst crop we've seen over the past 10 years as a barometer to see where we're trending, and to allow for early interventions before actually it gets too late. So I think that's an example. I think some of the other examples is some of the work we're doing around genomics, and being able to use genomic sort of indicators as a way to look at various microbes, our ability to actually track microbes and source track where they're coming from and things like that. So those are just some examples, but there's a number of others as well.
Thank you very much. We have a few more questions. Another question that I have here is that how is your traceability system together with this digital data technologies, that how Mars, like a big company, is handling these traceability issues at the company level? Over to you.
Yeah, and once again, a great question. It's an area we've been putting specific focus. Ooh, I'm sorry. It's an area we've been putting specific focus into, and it's an initiative we call our Track and Trace initiative. So what we are doing is looking at various ways that we can actually improve to have the right transparency and really traceability throughout the entire pipeline. We believe that this is an area that needs to be upgraded within our company, but also across the food industry as a whole. And it's an area that we believe, once again, that collaboration is a good way to go forward with this. But clearly, it's a work in progress for us. We do have tools in place that do work, but we believe we can do better. And that's, as I mentioned, is a big focus for us going forward.
Thank you very much. Another interesting question. What do you think is the best way for industry or private company to work with the government to create this food safety culture together, also to achieve food security together? Over to you.
Yeah, once again, these are all great questions. I mean, our learnings are that quality within a given factory, within a given value stream or what have you, is highly influenced by the quality culture. And it's been an area that we've spent significant amount of times working along with a number of collaborators to better understand how do you assess a quality culture within a factory or within a supply chain or even within a business, and really understanding how you can influence it. So I think there's a number of initiatives that are going on right now around quality culture. I know in the U.S. there's one that I think is being chaired by Frank Yanis from the FDA. I think there's a good opportunity to find out what's being done there, and participate if you can, or just observe would be a good thing, because a lot of that is focused on quality culture. And a lot of that is focused in on how do you measure it, how do you improve it, and how do you link that to quality performance.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that I have so many questions lined up, but then I think that we will have a discussion session later. So I will ask Bob to come online again to have discussion session together with all the panelists. So with that, thank you so much for your excellent presentations. And then I will bring the microphone back to my colleagues later. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Masami. So with Bob having set the scene on the use of science and especially scientific tools for food safety, we now have the great pleasure of introducing Delia Grace, who will be our next speaker. And Delia is an epidemiologist and veterinarian with more than 20 years of experience in developing countries. She has a very long and distinguished CV. So let me just say that among the many publications that she's authored, the one recommended reading right now is her most recent work with number of authors and UN Environment on preventing the next pandemic, which is a volume which has been written very simply and very beautifully to illustrate on how these pandemics and zoonosis can actually be prevented, and a lot of thinking there for all of us to go through. I will now invite Delia. Thank you, Delia, for joining us early in the morning from Nairobi on risk-based prioritization of food hazards. And over to you.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. A great pleasure to join you and to share some of our findings on prioritization of food hazards. Next slide, please. Just to give you a quick introduction to ILRI, we are the International Livestock Research Institute, which is part of the CGIAR, a research consortium that works in low and middle income countries to improve nutrition, livelihoods, and the natural environment. At the moment, we're actually undergoing a restructuring, which is going to turn us into one CGIR, but currently we consist of 15 different centres. ILRI itself is based in Africa, but we do quite a lot of work in Southeast Asia. Our main office is in Hanoi, Vietnam, and we also work in Laos, China, Cambodia, Thailand, Indonesia. Next slide, please. As I said, our main campus is in Nairobi, where we have BSL level 3 facilities, which allows us to do rather complicated work varying from microbiological to antimicrobial resistance to genomic sequencing. Next slide. And we also have a very large and very pleasant ranch where we keep a large number of cattle and sheep, giving us the opportunity to do field experiments. Next. So I'm going to focus on the informal sector. My work for the past 15 years, we do a little bit of work in the formal sector, but most of our work focuses on what we call the informal or traditional sector. It's a rather complex and heterogeneous assembly of food systems. We often think of it in terms of wet markets, but also it can include the street foods, raw milk being sold door to door, little mom and pop shops, dukas, kiosks. And it's defined in many, many ways. Here we define it as the sector which has no structured sanitary inspection. So it will often actually pay cesses or pay fines. There will be often some municipal oversight, but it is not a modern system. Workers are generally maybe family, they don't have health insurance. I think many of you know and live in areas where the informal sector is popular. Next. Thank you. The informal sector matters because it is still the main supplier of fresh produce and animal source food, by which we mean meat, milk, fish, and fresh leafy vegetables. And across a number of countries, we find from 70 to nearly 100% of these foods are supplied by the informal sector, although increasingly the formal sector, the supermarkets, are becoming important. It's also a very large supply of a major employer of people. The table in purple just shows you a study we did in Kenya. I won't go into it, but basically you can see that in terms of employment, the informal milk sector is nearly 90% of the workforce, and the large scale only around 10%. Next. And we've done lots and lots of studies in the informal sector looking at hazards. And if there's one thing we know is if we look for a hazard, we pretty much find it. I won't go through this in detail, but you can just see that there are, if you're just comparing the level of hazards, those are things in food that can cause harm. 98% of meat in Nigeria is unacceptable by one or more standard. 80% of farmed fish in Egypt is unacceptable. 24% of boiled milk in Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire, had unacceptable levels of Bacillus cereus, a rather unpleasant bacteria. Next. However, just because we find hazards doesn't necessarily mean that the informal sector is a huge problem which we have to get rid of immediately and do something about. After COVID, there were several calls from people who don't have a big informal sector, especially in the States, saying we need to close down wet markets or else we're going to get more pandemics. But one thing we found is that, and it's kind of a truism in food safety, that what people worry about and what kills them and makes them sick is not the same. So people tend to worry about chemicals, GMOs, pesticides, and yet food safety experts know that the most problematic pathogens, back please, are biological hazards. We did a 5-year study in Vietnam where many of the stakeholders were concerned about chemicals. The chemical risk assessment showed that there was almost no risk to human health. The quantitative microbial risk assessment, we looked at just one hazard out of the many, and around 13% of people got sick every year from salmonella acquired from pork. Next, please. So if our intuitions and if lay people and surveys are wrong, maybe the experts can help us prioritize food according to risk. However, unfortunately, experts are also wrong. This is a study from Ethiopia where we compared the experts in green to the actual surveys in blue. And what you can find is that experts think everything is important, especially the things they work on. And experts tend to prioritize most highly dread diseases like anthrax, even though anthrax kills almost nobody in Ethiopia, and E. coli kills a whole lot of people. Next. So I don't know if you noticed from the other slide that there was an interesting distribution. A few of the pathogens caused a lot of the problems, and many of the pathogens caused very few of the problems. And this is what we call the Pareto Principle, which applies to almost all human health problems. It's also sometimes called the vital few and the trivial many. The World Health Organization, for example, found that the top 10 human diseases caused 90% of the burden. A study we undertook at ILRI found the top 13 zoonoses were responsible for nearly 180,000 illnesses, whereas the next 43 were responsible for very few. So what happens in the absence of prioritization is everybody just focuses on the disease of interest to them, and scarce resources get spent unwisely. Next. So the best information we have on the actual human burden of foodborne disease comes from the World Health Organization, a study called the FERG, the Foodborne Epidemiology Reference Group. This looks at a total of nearly 40 hazards for which we have enough evidence to get a global estimate. And I'm just summarizing them here. The actual study breaks them out into heavy metals, into arsenic, mercury, cadmium, germs, into norovirus, salmonella, cysticercosis. Sorry, cysticercosis is a worm, not a germ. But this is our best estimates of what is killing people and making them sick. And as you can see, it's the germs, the worms, the heavy metals, which are the most important. So when resources are scarce, this is where we should focus. Next. And of course, when it comes to foodborne disease, it's not just dailies, as we sometimes call them, disability adjusted life years, it's also dollars. I was part of a recent study with the World Bank, and this just looked at the cost of foodborne disease. The first thing to notice is the huge cost. It's around $100 billion a year. That's an awful lot of money. Investments in foodborne disease are around $50 million a year. So an order of magnitude difference. The next important thing is that nearly all the loss comes from the loss of human life and illness, productivity loss, what we call. And the trade loss is actually quite small. And yet when we look at the investments, nearly all the investments have been done in trade loss or cost. Another example how if we don't prioritize, we look at the wrong things and we invest in the wrong things. Next. And of course, dailies are important and dollars are important, but food safety is much more than that. It's also a highly cultural and social issue. And other studies we've done have shown things like as value chains modernize, women are forced out. As you turn to supermarkets, local people lose their autonomy and become kind of low-grade employees by large supermarkets, not often getting good standard of life. There's increasing interest in the potential of nutritious and safe food to prevent childhood stunting, and food in informal markets is much cheaper than food in formal markets. So it's a big issue when you're thinking thinking of prioritization. Health impact is very important. It's often the most important. Economic impact should not be ignored, but also the whole social and cultural impact of food must be taken into account. Next, please. When we're talking about prioritizing hazards, it's not just about is it salmonella we should be worrying about, or is it anthrax? We also need to look at the value chains and the food. And we have less good information here, but our studies, many different studies, kind of agree that the two most risky types of food are the animal source food, here in green, meat, milk, fish, eggs, and the produce, that is the veggies, and to a lesser extent, fresh fruit. And these, of course, are among the most nutritious foods. So we again have a trade-off between risk and nutrition. Next. So if the traditional way we're doing it is wrong, and the traditional way people prioritize hazards, we've been looking at this for 20 years, it tends to be top-down and technocratic. It tends to look at the problem, not the size of the problem, not what can be done about it. And it might be better to focus on a smaller problem, which is easy to solve, than a bigger problem, which is almost impossible to solve. Everywhere we look at LMCs, there is unsystematic hazard selection, unsystematic hazard investigation, and very often the benefits and harms are not integrated. So people just look at the burden. They don't look at what is the good side of either formal sector or informal sector. Next, please. So what is the solution? Well, we have a solution. That's the good news. The solution is risk analysis. And risk analysis is a tool for decision-making under uncertainty. It consists of three interrelated areas. One is risk assessment. What is the risk to human health? How big is it? The second is risk management. What can we do about it and how much will that cost us? And cross-cutting everything is risk communication. So how do we bring in the stakeholders right from the beginning, the customers, the policymakers? Because unless we can communicate risk and risk management, we cannot create a culture of food safety. Next. I showed you this slide before. Whenever we look for hazards, especially in informal sector, we find very high levels of hazards. The hazards are things that can cause harm, but do they cause health risks? Do these hazards make us sick and kill us? Next. When we look at risks, we find a very different picture. That's because people have behaviors around food. So for example, in Kenya, where brucellosis is very high in milk, 99% of people boil their milk, and boiling new milk will kill the brucellosis, so the risk is very low. That's not to say risk is always low. Diarrhea is a proxy for foodborne disease. A lot of diarrhea doesn't come from food, it comes from anthropogenic or other sources, the environment, but at the same time it is an indicator. And again, when we do studies, we find that, in the ideal, in high-income countries, food is pretty safe and diarrhea is pretty low, whereas in some developing countries, it can be very high, and in others, it can be almost acceptable. So what do we do? How do we find out where this risk is coming from and what we can do about it? I'll just take you quickly through the pork value chain in Hanoi. And one of the best ways of managing risk is what we call the farm to fork. So let's start with the farm. Next. Here is a farm in Vietnam, and it's pretty safe. It's not very risky, but we do find that there is hazards coming in from inputs. And in fact, quite a lot of the salmonella in Vietnam came in the water, not in the food, but in the water on the farm. Next. The way pigs are slaughtered and processed, or cows or milk, is often very, very prone to leading to cross-contamination. Here you can see pigs slaughtered on the floor, on wood, in ways which are going to allow a feces from one pig to contaminate another. Next. Transport is far from ideal. Transport is often done in ways which is rather unsanitary and exposes carcasses to environmental contaminants. Next. And here we have a classic wet market where, again, we are seeing there's no cold chain, there's no running water, meat is cut on wooden blocks using instruments which is not very clean. Other sources for cross-contamination. Next. And here is what some people think is the solution, the formal system. And this is again in Vietnam. Here you have a cold chain, a cold cabinet. The meat is wrapped in cellophane. It's sold by people wearing white coats. Well, now surely we have managed to control the risks. Next. But when we do the studies, the higher the bar, the worse it is. That means the most of it fails the standards. And here you can see that in actual fact, the supermarket is worse than the wet market for nearly all measures we did of bacteria. And that's why we need to prioritize. If we don't prioritize, if we just go by our intuitions, as we said at the start, when people think it's the chemicals which are causing them cancer and making them ill, it's actually the germs. When people think that if everything is sold in a supermarket, it will be safe and they won't get sick, that's not what the studies are telling us. Over. Next. So yes, so that was just a quick run through some of what the science says, what the evidence says. The informal systems are there. They're going to be there for a long time. They have a lot of hazards. They don't always have a lot of risks. Sometimes they are better or no worse than the formal sector. And we're now working on lots of ways to try and make them safer with some success, I must say, and also quite a few failures. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Delia, for the very interesting presentation. Before going into the Q&A for your particular presentation, that I would like to inform the attendees that we have about 427 attendees listening into this conference, and there is an optimal view for your Zoom viewing. If you mouse over your screen and then go to the upper right corner, there is a view menu, and then if you select side-by-side gallery, then you will have a perfect optimal view of seeing the slide and then the speaker side-by-side. So I strongly suggest you choose that one. And then the present, the keynote speaker, her name is Delia, and then she will be preferring to be called Delia for the question and answer session. So if you use the Q&A box and then address her to ask specific questions, we should be able to pick up your questions. Don't use the chat box, but then use the Q&A box, then we will be able to pick up your questions. So now that I will return the microphone to Sridhar, who will be facilitating the Q&A session. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Amin. Thank you, Professor Grace. Indeed, some of the issues that you have raised through your presentation are what actually do come out in many regions of the world, especially the Asian Pacific, where we are, and Africa in many ways reflects the same situation. You did point out to an amazing level of hazards in many of the foods, and then you reflected upon the fact that not everything is actually killing people. But a lot of it is actually coming due to socioeconomic factors and probably environmental factors, and quality of water is always a critical issue everywhere. So in terms of food control, and this is where through all these seminars we are trying to link these issues, in terms of food control, then would you advise authorities to focus more on basic sets of codes of practices across the chains, whether and also in different locations, including and across storage, transport, or at the fresh market? And then the second thing, which actually leads us to, and very important information that you showed us on supermarkets, maybe you could give us some elaboration on the context, like what were the areas that were sampled, where you found the higher levels of microorganisms as compared to wet markets, and then we'll come to other questions. Over to you, Professor Grace.
Thank you, and some very pertinent questions there. Actually, in this study we did with the World Bank, led by Steve Jaffe, we came up with this interesting concept of the food safety life cycle. And it's, if you can imagine, it's like a curve where things, when you're right in the most basic situations in the village, where people eat little actually risky food. It's quite rare to eat meat, for example. When I was in West Africa, the only time we ate beef was when a cow died, and then it was a feast day. And it's a very short value chain, and people buy from people they know. And in these situations, actually, risks are not necessarily terribly high. But then as we start to modernize and urbanize and get complex risk chains and people eat risky food, and that's a lot the situation in much of the Asia and Pacific, we get an increase in food safety problems. It gets worse. And then, fortunately, things get better still. So as you move into high income countries and you get really kind of much more stringent, I mean, we heard a little bit from Mars, and you get much more sort of stringent systems and inspection and legal systems where people get sued if they kill people. Things tend to get better again. So yes, it is, we're kind of in the messy middle now, I think, in a lot of low and middle income countries where hazards are high and risks are high, and things may even get worse before they get better. For the supermarket, the issues are, and this surprises everybody, when we presented these results, people actually did not believe us, because they felt the supermarket must look clean, so therefore it should be safe. Some of the issues are that, one is that supermarkets in low and middle income countries are still emerging, so they do not always have the systems in place to ensure food is very safe. Secondly, they're still a very minority option. And so what happens is food often stays in a supermarket maybe for 2 or 3 days. Sure, it's clean and wrapped in cellophane, but bacteria grow very fast. And when there is, as often the case, electricity outages, the bacteria just shoot up like that. In the wet market, on the other hand, the pig is killed at 2 o'clock in the morning. It's in the wet market by maybe 6 or 7 and eaten by 12. Much less chance of risk. Going back to what you said, I kind of forgot to say it. In the most, should I say, least developed food systems, what you mentioned, the prerequisites, getting things clean, getting running water, getting, disinfection, getting waste disposal, absolutely, just work on that and you'll solve a lot of the problems. But once you start getting into these middle income countries and the increasing hazards, that's when you need to, and I say it as a scientist, you need to bring in the science, and you really need to work out what is the risk prioritization, because things which look quite bad can actually be not terribly bad, and things which look quite good can be terribly bad. And the only way you're going to find that out is doing what we call quantitative risk assessment and biological sampling of foods in markets, wet markets, supermarkets, all markets.
Thank you, Professor Grace. And to all the participants, I hope this has answered some of the questions that you actually posed to us, particularly on why the supermarkets showed a higher presence of bacteria and microorganisms. So, but if you have further, please keep posting. So this actually leads us to the other question, Professor Grace, and this is about fresh markets and wet markets. These are, of course, very popular all through developing countries, even in the Asia Pacific, in Africa. They are very much needed. They are a source of livelihood, and they are very important as quick sources of food supplies to many of the populations. And as you pointed out, in many places, such as in Kenya, you actually have 98% are actually informal sources. So any approach, and I'm sure this might have come up with the World Bank as well, that towards modernizing markets probably needs to focus more on the practice rather than on the facility or on the physical location. Because there does seem to be sometimes a tendency to, let's refurbish the whole market or let's shift it to some other place, which then most people don't want to get to, or even the vendors don't want to get to. So better self-regulation in markets, more market committees who are empowered to ensure hygiene and good practices, and then backed up with some of the civic services you were talking about, waste disposal and water. That would be the way forward for fresh markets and in the future. Over to you.
Yes, I mean, we sometimes say, well, in Africa, where I've lived for 20 years, people, very, very few people had what we call landlines, telephones, which, you know, are transmitted by copper wire, partly because they were very expensive, and partly because a lot of the traditional people used to cut down the copper wire and turn them into bracelets. And then what happened was we had a revolution where now pretty much everyone has a mobile phone. So we jumped from just talking to each other over the fences to having a mobile phone without ever having to go through having a landline, which was where I grew up in Ireland, which was, you know, the common way of communicating. And I think I wish we could do the same for food. We could go from the fresh, wet market to the farmers' markets. I don't know, I'm sure many of you have been in Europe and in places like Italy and France, and right in the middle of Paris, you'll see fresh outside markets selling fresh food in very clean and nice ways, and people buy small quantities, they chat with the vendor, and it's a very social and pleasant and hygienic way to sell food. So that would be my vision for wet markets. And I think in some places, maybe Singapore, maybe some of the Thailand, you know, night markets, we're nearly there. And you're exactly right. We're not going to get there by necessarily top-down regulation or moving markets away from their customers. Refurbishment is important, but what we've seen in many cases is people do the hard, that they what we might call, they do the hard skills, but not the soft skills. So they put in, you know, metal tables or whatever, but they don't train people, they don't train the vendors, they don't create this culture of food safety. But yet training by itself is not enough. What we see as essential is incentives. So there must be a strong, clear, direct motivation for the vendor to actually change his behavior, her behavior. It's often a lady, by the way, in Southeast Asia. And that can be done by either community pressure, it can be done by municipal authorities, or it can be done by consumer demand. And we're very interested in raising awareness of consumers and helping them understand, you know, what is safe, fresh, nutritious food, and encouraging to get us and putting pressure. It's what we sometimes call forcing value down the supply chain. So if the consumer knows and wants safe food, they will demand it from the vendor. The vendor then will demand it from the supplier, and the supplier will demand it from the farmer.
Yes, that was very interesting. And thank you for, in fact, these are two very good messages that we've just got from what you said. One is to focus a lot on the soft skills and not so much on the hardware, although the hardware is important too, but a lot, and that's something that we want to propagate through this conference, is that when we give the message of regulate, delegate, and participate, we're actually saying that the softer skills are more important in many ways to keep our food safe. And the second thing, I think, an issue that an FAO itself is very close to FAO's mandate is on the work on gender, on actually improving, using a much more gender-based approach towards food safety could actually give us very good results in this region. So those are two very good messages from you. Thank you. So one last question, just to end this part of the keynotes. If I can ask you something about the One Health approach to food safety, because a lot of it here, what you've talked about, animal health, biosecurity, fresh markets, hygiene, the role of people and the role of the environment, having all the systems of disposal, waste disposal as and water supply. This is all essentially a One Health approach to food safety, and having this environment would actually be much more useful than actually trying to have any other ways of achieving. Is a much more participatory way, we would think. So just a few comments from you on this would be very useful. Thank you.
I'm delighted to finish on this note. I actually started my first work in Asia was with avian influenza when that started, in the beginning of the 2000s. And at that time, One Health was thought to be very much around emerging infectious diseases, the SARS, the MERS, and it wasn't really considered, essential to food safety. But our work has shown that really food safety is almost the quintessential One Health issue. It is an issue where, as you say, everything comes together, and including, as we see it with increasing wealth, urbanization, modernization in Africa and Asia. We're seeing big increase in consumption of wild meat, exotic meat, farming of exotic animals. We're all aware of COVID. It's not the first, it won't be the last. And these are intrinsic to the food systems, to the way food is caught, whether it's bats spreading Ebola or monkeypox from wild primates being caught. These spillovers occur because of our food systems are to some extent broken. And the only way we can fix these broken food systems is by looking at the source of the problems. And it is not just one source. Some people just point at the wet market and say, that's the problem. It's not the problem. The problem is the interface of the environment, wildlife, livestock, and then the whole farm to fork chain, as I ran you through, from farm to processing to transport to selling. And One Health, I think, provides a unique tool to bring in all the partners, from the ecologists, the medical people, the veterinarians, to really, first of all, identify the hotspots, the problems, and then the solutions. And sometimes they can be quite simple solutions. It doesn't mean we have to stop eating meat or we have to stop eating vegetables. We can de-risk these chains, and we can do that by using the lessons and the partnerships, the collaborations that come from One Health. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Delia. That was a very interesting presentation, and also this discussion has been very fruitful. Lots of participants are writing that they really loved your presentation, so thank you very much. Now that I would like to have a little break, but then during this break, we would like to show you this usual interesting videos that this time that we are having one from the Kingdom of Bhutan, and then also one from the Philippines. So 2 videos will be shown, but then meanwhile, I would like you to tell you that Bob and then Delia is online. So if you would like to ask them questions, please write your question in the Q&A box. Then I hope that Bob and Delia will be able to give some minutes to answer some of the questions online. So with that video, we will break for 10 minutes. So see you in 10 minutes. Thank you.
The concept of food safety is relatively a new subject for majority of the Bhutanese, especially the rural population in Bhutan. Now things are changing with the rapid urbanization and the change in the food consumption pattern, and there is an increased demand for processed food and meat which cannot be met from the local production. Further, being an import-dependent economy, our dependency on imported food to meet our nutritional demand does not help either. Therefore, food safety exists and it is real. Since the establishment of Bhutan Agriculture and Food Regulatory Authority in the year 2000 as the competent authority for biosecurity and food safety in the country, there has been several visible changes in the area of food safety. The standard in hygiene of the meat shops and food establishments in the country have drastically improved over the years. There has been increased food safety awareness among the food businesses and consumers. Bhutan must be one of the few countries wherein each and every food handler in the country needs to get a food handler's training and license to work in the food business. The soft skills of the food inspectors has improved over the years, and this is evident from the feedback received from the food business community, wherein they have now begun to see the Bhutan Agriculture and Food Regulatory Authority more of a facilitator rather than a sole law enforcement agency. FAO has been instrumental in introducing food safety in the country and building the Bhutan Agriculture and Food Regulatory Authority as a food safety agency right from the inception. The Food Act of Bhutan 2005 has been developed in collaboration with the FAO. Since then, numerous FAO and BAFRA collaborative efforts have been made, such as the FAO TCP projects for strengthening food safety and standards. And we have several recent initiatives that include, number one, the development of food safety indicators for Bhutan, which can be used as a tool for evaluating the performance of food safety initiatives and also determine the current status of food safety in the country. And second one that I would like to cite is the concept of food safety culture introduced in Bhutan last year. This will help address food safety risks using an integrated approach that emphasizes on culture improvement and self-compliance by the food business operators. The third one that I have is the development of biosecurity strategy. It is to reassess the current biosecurity situation in the country and to understand the current capacity in terms of, number one, prevention, number two, preparedness, number three, early detection, and number four, response to biosecurity risks, including food safety. I would like to assure that the Royal Government of Bhutan and the Ministry is committed to promoting food safety activities in the country, and I welcome future collaborations from FAO in the area of food safety in Bhutan.
Access to safe, affordable, and nutritious food is a right that every Filipino should enjoy. It comes with a recognition that an effective food safety system is key not only to safeguard the health and general well-being of people, but also to foster economic development. Food safety goes along with our vision of helping Filipino food producers. Food trade of frozen chicken, pork, fish are very important in the economy. We ensure that food quality is highly considered so that food producers enjoy good prices, at the same time protecting the country from any entry of contaminated food. The Department of Agriculture, together with its food safety regulatory agencies and offices, is continuously effecting several initiatives to realize its role under the Food Safety Act, as it acknowledges its strengthened mandates. In 2016, the Department Order Number 07 Series of 2016, amending Department Order Number 3, establishing the Department of Agriculture, institutional structure and arrangements on regulatory policy work streams, coordination and monitoring, was issued to streamline the regulatory policies and services of the department. There is also the Department Order Number 07, Series of 2017, regarding the designating the Agricultural Training Institute as lead agency in developing and coordinating a food safety regulation training program for the Department of Agriculture, which aims to develop a standard food safety training course for government personnel, food business operators, and food handlers involved in the primary and post-harvest stages of the food supply chain. Recently, the DA issued Department Order Number 07, Series of 2018, on establishing the DA Food Safety Program for the primary and post-harvest food and feed production sectors of agriculture and fisheries, and creating the DA Food Safety Body, which aims to fully carry out the mandate and requirements of the Food Safety Act through the development and implementation of a sustained food safety program instigated at the national level and cascaded down to the regional, provincial, and municipal levels. To have a more effective coordination and linkage with various FSRAs and other support agencies identified in the Food Safety Act of 2013, the Department of Agriculture initiated the creation of a food safety focal group by virtue of Special Order Number 155, Series of 2018, and was amended through Special Order 445 last May 2020 to enhance food safety initiatives at the regional level, leading to the creation of the Regional Food Safety Group. We sent representatives to the first World Food Safety Day last June 2019, reviewing our commitment to food safety with FAO. We had representations in the FAO Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific, FAO RAP, consultation on food safety indicators in December 2017 in Singapore, wherein a review of food safety indicators was made to pinpoint which are useful in terms of our country's priorities. This was pushed in January 2019 with the approval of the FAO DA-initiated project called Development of National Food Safety Indicators in the Philippines with a One Health approach. The Philippine College of Veterinary Public Health served as the service provider. A series of workshops were conducted, participated by DA's food safety regulatory agencies, FSRAs, particularly the Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources, BIFAR, and the National Meat Inspection Service, NMIS, with the objective of improving the national food control system and in the planning of food safety programs using these indicators. The Philippines, together with Bhutan, China, and Cook Islands, are the FAO pilot areas in this project on food safety indicators, where a regional meeting was held in Wuhan, China in November 2019.
Hello and welcome back. I hope all of you had the chance to refresh yourself in one form or the other, and depending on the time of the day. We now have a series of presentations on very important studies that have been carried out in this region by various experts. And this will follow on the background that has been set by the two keynote speakers this morning by Bob Baker and Delia Grace, on the, especially who emphasized both of them on the importance of science. So it's my great pleasure to introduce my dear colleague, Masami Takeuchi, whom you've heard quite a bit already during this day and also Tuesday, who will be giving the next presentation. Now, Masami has been working with FAO both in the headquarters in Rome and with us in Bangkok for many years now. And let me just say in very simple terms that she's associated or almost synonymous with data, evidence, and science, and especially microbiology, which is her chosen field. And she has done a lot of work with the Codex Secretariat on risk assessments, on actually showing the power of data and evidence for standard setting. So she will talk more about that in her presentation. So over to you, Masami.
Thank you very much, Sridhar, for a very nice the introduction of Mike. And yes, like he said, that my presentation title is Food Safety Risk Analysis, the Power of Data. Next, please. So we have been talking about science and then the importance of data for many minutes now. That the Bob's presentation has been very interesting, and then followed by the Delia's very nice presentation. And then we are so convinced already that the data is important in the area of food safety. I just wanted to point out four major points that we think that why data are so important. First, in food safety area, it is very essential that the policymakers have to make a decision in the food management. And then data will help them tremendously to make informed decisions. And then this informed decision will not going to be personal decisions or somebody's preference. It will be evidence-based, risk-based problem identification, and then Delia already talked about the importance of prioritization because nobody has enough resources on anything. And then this resource allocation will be very effective if you have a prioritization tool. So data is going to help tremendously to make informed decision. That is the first point. The second point is to back up your theory. If something goes wrong, then data will help you to make sure that your theories and then your ideas will be really effective and then also the accurate. So it will help you to verify and then validate of your risk management decisions. You make the informed decision making and then you can verify the decision making and then also the actions. The number three is probably very applicable to many countries that you are from, the attendees, that data will help you to know exactly where things stand. So where you stand. So data can help you understand what to do to improve the situations or where you are going from the current situation. It can be helpful to benchmark yourself. The last point, but the very important point, is that data can promote transparency and communication because data talk and then they are very convincing. Data promote sharing and support because there are things to talk about. Quantified information is very powerful. Next, please. So Delia has already introduced this risk analysis paradigm, and then I am having a slightly different diagram, but then exactly the same thing. So one side we have a risk assessment, which is the scientific part, and then another side that the risk management exists. And then we communicate between risk assessment and the risk management, and then the communication are not only between them, but then also with the stakeholders. So I put the circle around it. And then I would like draw your attention to the risk assessment part, which is the science part. As you can see, I put 4 points. Those are the elements that are inside of the risk assessment process. First, the hazard identification, and then this hazard needs to be characterized. Then we conduct exposure assessment. Then we can really do the risk characterization. Here that the important thing about this hazard and risk terminologies is that hazard is a substance. It's an agent. We are talking about various hazard. We are talking about microbiological hazard. We are talking about chemical hazard. We can talk about physical hazard or some other emerging issues that could be a hazard. But then hazard itself, it's just existing there. Then this idea of risk comes in. Risk is not a hazard. Risk is a function of a probability, meaning that risk can be high or low. So we are talking about, for example, very common pathogen like Salmonella. If Salmonella can be treated in the heat cooking, for example, in food, then risk goes down. So hazard still is there, but then risk can decrease. So this is what we are talking about in terms of the risk characterization, that how we deal with this high risk food or low risk food. But then people often ask us, FAO, that what are the main food that you think it is high risk? And then this is very, very difficult questions because in one same commodity, the risk can be high or low, depending on the conditions, depending on the treatment, depending on how we manage the situation. So that's why that this risk analysis paradigm is very important to understand what data, what information we are talking about. But then as you can see in this diagram, in risk assessment, which I usually do in the FAO work, data are essential. If there is no data, it's very difficult to conduct risk assessment. Next slide, please. And here are the two issues that I encounter all the time in countries with very low-income countries or middle-income countries, and then they are trying to improve their food safety, food control systems. And then what they say is that we have no data. We have very limited data. Where is the data? We don't have access to the data. We don't have a very good validated data. This is the problem. And then also the countries often tell us that we don't have a capacity. We have very limited capacity to be able to sample the food and analyze the food in the laboratory. And then how do we interpret the data that comes out of the analysis? We don't have the capacity. But then is it really true? I have visited many, many countries in the region, in Asia and the Pacific, and then this is what I found out. Next slide, please. Basically, any countries, even very low income country that I found some data do exist. There could be some ad hoc data that the university researchers are collecting. Only few data is fine that it still indicates something. There might be industry data. There could be an international assessment, risk assessment results available freely. We can totally use those international assessment data. Maybe other countries can show you that the data from their countries, maybe that it's similar to what your country is having. For example, I'm talking about this exposure assessment. You may have a neighboring countries who may have a similar consumption pattern of food. And then if the neighboring country have their consumption pattern data, maybe that is something that your country can use. And then if the industry is willing to partner with the government, then this risk assessment is possible, not a full-fledged risk assessment, but then still some data do exist. What doesn't exist is mostly this system to streamline the data collection. So this is something that the FAO can always help, and then always try to collect those data in a very systematic way. It doesn't have to be a super advanced technology. We just need to partner, and then we need to collaborate. I know that this is a very challenging activities, but then I would say that this complaining that there's no data or we don't have data to do anything about science, it's not correct. And then also this capacity issues. I always find that brilliant, very capable people in any countries in the region. So how do we go about in terms of the risk assessment, which that the government usually would be tasked to do, that inside of the government, yes, there may be only few people who know about some very particular issues, but then there could be a way to make a mechanism to tap into the expertise outside of this very small circle of the government agencies, maybe international organizations like ours, or universities. There could be a brilliant scientists and researchers must be within your country. There could be a great experts in the industry. Perhaps we can find a laboratory inside of the country or even outside of the country in the region so that we can partner. So those are the solutions that can really address this no limited data or no limited capacity situation in some of those very low income, middle income countries. Next slide, please. Now that speaking about this capacity issues, and then also the data, the information issues, that the FAO does have lots of publications that the people may or may not aware of. I just pick few publications. One from the very recent publication from last year on the climate change. It's entitled "Unpacking the Burden of Food Safety." And then also we have a very good publication from our plant protection division in FAO, understanding the international harmonization of the pesticide residue for the Codex standards. So those two documents basically provide lots of information and data collected by international experts, and then it is explained in narrative that how you can use this information in your country context, and then how you can harmonize those international information or international framework into your specific unique country context. So evidence-based international studied information are basically available in such publications. What you probably need to do is to discuss about it among the stakeholders. Next slide, please. Speaking about the methodologies and approaches, I picked those two publications. First one, the blue one, is a risk assessment tool for Vibrio, just one of the examples. This came out last year once again, and then this is basically to giving the countries to show that how this tool can be used in the national context to understand the burden, and then also the how to conduct the risk assessment for Vibrio in seafood. So this is a very good, very scientific publication from FAO and WHO. Really illustrating the step-by-step way to do the risk assessment of this pathogen. And then another tool right next to it is the FAO guide to ranking food safety risks at the national level. So this gives you this multi-criteria risk ranking methodology. So basically this is really telling you that how you can use the realistically available data in your country to do this risk ranking so that you can actually prioritize. Remember that Delia's presentation was saying that the prioritization is very useful with the data, but then this guide is really telling you that what you can do at this stage with your capacity, with the limited data, that what you can do about risk ranking. So tools for science-based risk assessment and then risk ranking are also available. There are many publications like this coming out from FAO and WHO. So my suggestion is for everybody to check out those publications coming out. Next, please. The lastly that I would like to explain about the signature initiative that this region has done for the last 3 years. It is called FAO Regional Food Safety Indicators Project for Asia and the Pacific. And you have heard of this project from various videos that have been shown today, also from the Tuesday that some countries are mentioning about it. Because we have done a big consultative meeting starting in 2017. And then in this meeting, the regional meeting, that all the experts came to the meeting, set 40 regional food safety indicator areas. The purpose of setting those areas was to understand if we can collect and generate data from those areas. And then second, that countries consider what can be measured right now with this limited data, limited capacity situation, what can we have? And then we had 4 pilot countries volunteer to do this initiative. That was Bhutan, China, Cook Islands, and Philippines. Those 4 countries came forward to try this food safety indicator project, and then there were surprising results. There is a saying that what gets measured gets done. It's almost close to there. What gets measured gets managed, I would say. So basically that those 4 countries set out those indicators, and then they try to measure the benchmark, and then try to improve with the intervention, and then they try to measure again so that they can compare the benchmark and then after the intervention data. And then you know what, all the data went up, meaning that food safety control increased in a better way, meaning that because everybody knows that this is being measured, everybody tried very hard, make a very good efforts, and then in the end the capacity was developed, and then also the improved knowledge was there, and then advocacy was made. Now that we are developing a guide for the region, and then it will be published as a part of the toolkit that was launched on Tuesday. So basically by December or maybe early next year, you will have a toolkit in the region, including this food safety indicators guide. So I hope that you will like the guide. Next, please. And then this is the take-home message, basically, that global food safety can benefit from data, information, science, technology, and innovation. These are the take-home message. Number 1 is that engage with the public-private partnerships. We have heard from Bob, we have heard from Delia, they're from the industry, and then research, and then the government, and like we can have a cross-cutting, cross-sectoral collaboration. FAO is ready to assist countries. And then also that the FAO is really promoting innovative approach to do the food safety improvement. And once again, prioritization. We don't have very, very big sufficient resource for everything. We don't. So it is important to think about this risk-based management and risk-based the conduct of the food safety management. And in the end, the food safety is a shared responsibility. So prioritization and then also the partnership would be the key for data collection and data generation too. So next, please. So thank you very much. And then if you have any questions, perhaps I can take it at the end of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Masami, and thank you for putting this picture up front in front of all the participants about the way data is collected, assessed, and then used as a scientific basis for food safety risk management and also for actions. So this essentially what Masami has laid out here is that it's a picture which is quite complex, needs a lot of technical capacity. And that's where the importance of sharing this between countries through organizations like FAO and WHO actually comes in, because not every country has the capacity or the level of training that's required for a lot of these scientific analysis. So Masami, maybe we could just have a couple of questions before we move on to the next speaker. So looking at some of the questions that have come in, so one of the issues that participants do raise, that how do we actually share this information, that not every country has, for instance, the ability to analyze exposure to a hazard and then see if this becomes a risk. So how can they, what are the kind of platforms or the mechanisms that they can use to access that information? Over to you.
Thank you very much. Very good question. That this data sharing is the next step that when we tackle this data generation, data collection issues, and then it is a very important point. For example, for the exposure assessment, FAO and WHO has this platform called the GIFT, and then we are collecting this food consumption data from all over the world. And then it doesn't mean that all the country have to give the detailed information about every single province or city, but then it has a very good way of collecting the overall data of the national consumption data, which can be tailored into some very good analytical tool for the consumption data. So my suggestion is that the most of the data that we are talking about, including this exposure data, that international organization has a platform. And then, for example, that the chemical contaminants, that we have a joint expert committee on the food contaminants and then additives. This committee does have a database, and then we do have this risk assessment process that we do call for data. And then so country are able to share the data, will submit the data, and then this data can be really put into the some sort of package so that other countries can use later on in the publication. So my suggestion is that country can participate very actively in the international standard setting activities like Codex Alimentarius, so that there would be a huge repository of data, and then there is usable data available in this kind of repository. So I think that the best way forward for the countries to go about in terms of the data sharing is to join those kind of regional or international collaborative bodies, so that it will benefit both that users and then also the submitters. Thank you.
Thank you, Masami. So a reminder again to all the participants that both the keynote speakers, Bob and Delia Grace, are online, and so is Masami, of course. So you can continue to write questions on the Q&A, and we'll take it up under discussion after we have the next couple of presentations. So thank you again, Masami, for the great presentation on the power of data. So the next presentation is by Dr. Fatima Udom-Pitikul, who is the Assistant Professor at the Department of Food Science and Technology, Faculty of Agro-Industry, Kasetsart in University, Thailand. So they are our neighbors here. And Dr. Fatima is worked on areas of food microbiology, food safety, and foodborne pathogens. And as you can see on the title itself, she's going to talk about a particular foodborne pathogen, Clostridium, and its spore germination and inactivation, and provide us an update on how this can be used to inactivate foodborne pathogens in food products and food processing environments. So first of all, Dr. Fatima, thank you for joining us at this conference, and over to you.
Thank you very much for such a wonderful presentation. So it is my honor to present some of the recent findings regarding the Clostridium spore germination and inactivation here. So let me introduce myself again. So my name is Fatima Udom-Pitikul. I'm from the Department of Food Science and Technology, Faculty of Agro-Industry, Kasetsart University in Bangkok, Thailand. And so now let's start with the presentation. Next slide, please. So I pretty much work in the area of spore forming bacteria for quite a while, particularly in the Clostridiums. So let me introduce about the Clostridium species. So Clostridium, as we know, is a diverse group of gram-positive anaerobic endospore forming bacteria. So Clostridium is ubiquitous, widespread in the environment. So they can be found in soils, sediment, even in raw material or food product, and in the gastrointestinal tract of human and animal. So as you can see that there are many potential route of contamination from Clostridium into food product or the raw materials. One unique feature of the Clostridium is that its abilities to produce the highly resistant endospores. So we know that endospore that produced by bacteria is highly resistant. And in fact, there are many mechanisms that's responsible to the highly resistant of endospore. Endospore of Clostridium is highly resistant to many, let's say, environmental stress as well as the preservative measure. And some Clostridium has a role as in food associated as a pathogenic microorganism like Clostridium perfringens that cause food poisoning, Clostridium difficile that now has been more evident that it could be cause the disease due to the come from the food, as well as the Clostridium botulinum, which is a well-known toxin-producing microorganism. Not only the pathogenic point of view, Clostridium also has an important role as a spoilage microorganism. For example, like Clostridium thermosaccharolithecum or Clostridium frigidicinis. Next slide, please. So pretty much my talk, we are going to go through about the spore germination. So spore germination is one of the most important steps in the life cycle of the spore forming bacteria. Mostly the spore germination has been studied in the bacillus, especially Bacillus subtilis as a model microorganism. But later, because Clostridium also has an important role in both as a pathogenic microorganism as well as a food spoiler. So the interest has come to the germination mechanism of the Clostridium spore. So just a brief introduction about the spore germination. Germination is a irreversible and rapid change in the cytology and the chemical makeup of the spore. So one important feature about the spore when it germinates, that it's gonna go through outgrown and then become the vegetative cell grown. When it becomes vegetative cell grown, so like for other some Clostridium, they can increase in the cell number rapidly and causing food spoilage or reach the infection dose to cause a foodborne disease. But another important thing about spore germination is that upon germination, spore lost the intrinsic resistant properties. So meaning that upon germination, it is easier for the germinating spore to be killed or to be inactivated. Next slide, please. So let's briefly go through the event in spore germination. For the event in spore germination, mostly the data come from the Bacillus species, but the event is pretty, let's just say, similar in the Clostridium species as well. So once the spore, even though it's kind of metabolically dormant, it can sense the surrounding environment. And then once the condition is kind of favorable for growth, the small molecule termed as a germinant that we will talk later can be sensed by the germinant receptor, which is located in the spore inner membranes. Once the germinant receptor senses the presence of germinants, it initiates the process of spore germination, like the commitment to germinate that lead to the release of cations, and then the release of calcium dipicolinic acid, which is a compound that found in the spore of the bacteria. And then stage 1, the later is a partial cohydration, and then spore start to lose some resistant property. So now let's move on to the stage 2. Stage 2, Once the spore process through the stage 1, the stage 2 start with the spore cortex peptidoglycan hydrolysis, and then further core hydration to like take up more water, and then the core part expansion and loss of more of the resistant properties, and then spore loss dormancy before going through the state of outgrown. So as I mentioned earlier, that if we can understand clearly the step of the mechanism of spore germination, so it's one of the key that we can think about the way that we could inactivate the spore, or we can induce the spore to germinate and then kill the less resistant spore. Next slide, please. So here is the current tentative model for spore germination. As I mentioned earlier, that most of the work has been done in Bacillus, especially Bacillus subtilis. And now there are some model that has been proposed for other Clostridium as well. So pretty much the difference between the major difference in the germination of Bacillus and Clostridium is how the spore sense the presence of signal. Signal in this term mean the germinant, that okay, the environmental condition or the condition in food is kind of favorable for them to start to germinate. And then because germination is a reversible step, to start to germinate and proceeding to outgrown and then vegetative cell growth. So the main difference is how the Bacillus and Clostridium sense the presence of the nutrient, as well as how the cortex lytic enzyme, which is responsible for the hydrolysis of the cortex peptidoglycan activated. For the event of the spore germination is quite similar between Bacillus and Clostridium. As you can see from this model, there are still some unanswered questions regarding the protein involved or the mechanism of the spore germination in Clostridium, or the event of the calcium dithycholic acid release, as well as the process of the spore cortex lytic enzyme, that some evidence suggests that the cortex hydrolysis has preceded the release of calcium dithycholic acid in case of Clostridium species. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you very much. So I briefly talk about the significance of spore germination. As we now know that germination is the first step in the development of actively growing vegetative cell from the dormant spore. Spore can be dormant for a long period of time. At the same time, if they sense the presence of germinant or the condition for growth is favorable for their growth, so they can start the process of germination in such a short period of time. Spore germination can be initiated by a variety of small molecules as a nutrient termed germinant. So what's the significance of spore germination? In many food-related spore-forming bacteria, germination is an essential step for causing foodborne illness, because when one spore becomes germinate and then proceed to vegetative growth and then multiply in the number to reach the infection dose, or during the vegetative growth, they can produce some toxin that cause the foodborne disease. So if we now know the way of to block germination, that means we can control the population of bacteria in spore, not to reach the level that could that cause food spoilage, or reach the level of the infectious dose that cause the disease. And as I mentioned previously, that spore lost the resistant property upon germination. So this comes to another approach. First approach we talk about, if we know how to block the germination, it means that, okay, it's kind of now, we can cut the subsequent process. So the bacteria will not multiply and increase in the cell number in population, for example, in food. But for the second approach, by losing resistance upon germination, we could use the approach to induce spore to germinate, to maximize the spore germination. And then right away, we use the secondary method to inactivate the germinating spore, especially we can use the milder treatment because as we know that spore is highly resistant. So normally if we would like to inactivate bacterial spore, we have to use maybe like the highly concentrated chemical or use like a very harsh preservative measure. But once the spore becomes germinate, it's less resistant. So we can use the milder treatment in order to inactivate the bacterial spore. Next slide, please. So this is just the summary of example of the identified germinant, the nutrient germinant for the Clostridium spore. Because pretty much I work on the spore germination together with my colleague and my major professor at the Oregon State University. So we pretty much work on the Clostridium perfringens and identify the nutrient germinants for the spore of Clostridium and some other information regarding the germinant for other Clostridium species. As you can see that most of the identified germinant for Clostridium spore are like amino acid or some other co-germinant. So by gathering this information, so we now can know that, okay, if we would like to induce the spore to germinate, to maximize spore germination, what the condition that we should proceed to further study to induce the germination as much as possible. Therefore, we could cue by the subsequent inactivation measure. Next slide, please. And recently, we have been working on the identify the new germinant for the spore of Clostridium perfringens, which has a Clostridium perfringens enterotoxin gene on the plasmid. Because now there are more evidence that the plasmid-borne CPEC perfringens isolate can be a cause of the foodborne illness as well. So it is interesting to identify the germinant for this type of isolate as well. And as we can see that together with the sodium bicarbonate as a co-germinant, so at least 14 different amino acids has been identified as a newly identified germinant for the plasmid-borne CPE Clostridium perfringens spore. Next slide, please. And as mentioned earlier that by inducing spore to germinate, it can enhance the efficacy of the other inactivation measure to inactivate the germinating spore, which is less resistant as compared to the dormant spore. So I gathered some information about the germination-induced spore inactivation measure. So these are for the Bacillus species. So for the germinating spore, the information point to the finding that by inducing spore to germinate with various kind of germinant, which is, as you can see, is quite species specific. It can increase the reduction of the spore as compared to the dormant cell. Next slide, please. And these are some examples for the Clostridium, many Clostridium spore that has been induced to germinate and then inactivate by various measures. Some spore, like the attached spore, which is quite difficult to food contact surface, that's quite difficult to inactivate. So the inactivation has been improved if we can induce spore to germinate first. Next slide, please. But what's the challenge for the germination induced and then subsequent inactivation? The challenge are the existence of superdormant spore. Superdormant spore meaning that the spore that not generally or readily germinate, even in the presence of the germinant. So there are some population, some spore in the population that cannot germinate normally. And the second one is the heterogeneity of the germination response of spore in population. Because each individual spore not germinate at the same time, so there are some spore that germinate more readily than the others, even within the same species or the same strain. and the presence of mixed species in the food matrix or food processing environment. So as you can see in the food processing environment or food matrix, the spore that present is not just one species. There are many species together. So it's put a challenge that we have to try to identify the universal germinant that can induce the germination of mixed population of species and the germination diversity among species and strains. So for the future direction for this approach, it is better. It is very useful if we can elucidate the mechanism of spore superdormancy. So if we understand the mechanism, we can try to find a way to overcome the superdormancy and identify the appropriate germinant and condition to maximize the germination of the majority of spore in a population. And then, as I mentioned earlier, develop the universal germinant for many important food-related spore-forming bacteria that possibly harbor together in the food system or the food processing environment. Next slide, please. And these are some of the examples that of the work of the spore inactivation measure on the Clostridium perfringens that has been published recently that I have been working as a collaborate work. Next slide, please. So the work on the adherence of Clostridium perfringens spore, both the isolate that has been, the clinical isolate that has been associated with food poisoning and the non-foodborne gastrointestinal disease. Actually, the spore of Clostridium can persist and attach firmly to the model food contact surface, which is a stainless steel, and it's kind of attached in a single layer cluster. Next slide, please. So now we know that the spore of Clostridium can persist and attach firmly to the surface, like the model food contact surface, which is a stainless steel. We try to access the ability of the cleaning in place procedure to access whether it has the ability to inactivate bacterial spore that has been adhered to the surface. And as we can see, you can see that once the spore attached to the surface, if we just use the water with some physical force, the number of reduction is very limited. The removal could come from the physical force, and if use only the high temperature together with the physical force that typically used with the water to see as a control, again, the number of the spore, Clostridium perfringens spore adhere to the surface, very limited. But once the compound that we use during the cleaning in place regimen has been employed, which is the sodium hydroxide at 65 degrees Celsius. As you can see that for all strain that we test, the number of the attached spore drop down to undetectable level. And with the complete of the cleaning in place regimen that often followed by the treatment with acid at high temperature, again, the result is no detectable level. So in fact that the bacterial, the Clostridium perfringens spore that adhere to stainless steel surface can, let's just say, completely remove with the step of the alkali treatment at high temperature. Next slide, please. And another work about try to identify the natural antimicrobial agent to combat with the Clostridium perfringens spore. So I show some of the result. So the chitosan at the even low germination. So there is a potential that to use this as a kind of antimicrobial agent to try to combat with the Clostridium perfringens in the food matrix. Next slide, please. Okay, so the inhibitory effect of chitosan on the Clostridium perfringens spore in cooked chicken. So the low molecular weight chitosan at different concentration has been incorporated in the cooked chicken, and then test for its ability to control the growth from spore of Clostridium perfringens during abusive storage condition that we try to mimic the worst case scenario that 37 degrees Celsius under anaerobic condition to let's just say mimic the worst case that the Clostridium perfringens can grow. So as you can see that with the incorporation of chitosan at the concentration of 2 milligram per gram or above that, the number of Clostridium perfringens can be controlled during the 18 hours of the storage at abusive condition. Next slide, please. Still, even though we start to try to identify the new antimicrobial agent to try to inactivate the spore or control the growth from spore of food poisoning related Clostridium perfringens, there are some still challenges that still need to work on, like we still need to try to identify the alternative antimicrobial agents to control the germination and outgrowth of bacterial spore in the actual food product. Because many times that once the antimicrobial agent has been tested on the actual food product, its efficacy has been different as compared to the its efficacy when tested on like the suspension test on laboratory media. And effective, we have to identify effective and more environmental friendly method to eliminate spore from food processing environment, because spore can be persist on the food processing environment for quite a period of time, and then it can even like cross contamination in food product once contact to that food contact surface. So if we can find the way to more environmentally and effective measure, it would be great. And we have to understand the resistant mechanism of food-related spore former, in order that if we know the mechanism, we know the target that we should move on and try to attack that target. And elucidate the mode of action of antimicrobial agents against food-related bacterial spore. So not only we know that, okay, if we use these agents, we can inactivate spore. It is more useful if we know the mode of action, that how it kill or inactivate bacterial spore. Next slide, please. And last but not least, I would like to express my gratitude to my department, Department of Food Science and Technology, Faculty of Agro-Industry, Kasetsat University, and my major professor during my PhD study, Professor Dr. Mahfouz Saker from Oregon State University, and Dr. Saker lab member that has been worked like continue working collaboratively, and the Kasetsat University Food Microbiology team. Mr. Kanashiyam, my graduate student, and funding source, Kurdi, the Graduate School of Kasetsat University, and the Agricultural Research Foundation at Oregon State University. Thank you very much and for your attention. And I would be happy to answer your question at the end of the at the discussion session.
Thank you very much, Fatima. Okay, so yes, we will take questions after all the panelists. So let's go to the next session. Sridhar, please.
Thank you, Dr. Fatima. So we'll have a discussion again towards the end of the session. At this point, I think it will be my pleasure now to invite Dr. Timothy Barkham, who is going to speak about a specific strain of Streptococcus agalactiae in humans and tilapia. Dr. Barkham works at Tan Tock Seng Hospital in Singapore. He is an infectious disease specialist by profession, essentially a doctor, and he also has a teaching appointment at the National University of Singapore. So Dr. Barkham's presentation will be by a video recording, which we will play from here. But he's available live for the discussion, which we will follow after his presentation. So please play the video.
Hello. I'm going to talk to you about Streptococcus agalactiae sequence type 283 in humans and tilapia. This is the organism on blood agar and down the microscope. Now, Streptococcus agalactiae is also known as the group B strep, so I'll call it GBS. This is a gut organism found in many animals. It's very important for animal health because it is the main cause of bovine mastitis. It interrupts the flow of milk, which is why the organism is called agalactiae. It's also a well-known cause of illness in fish, and this is called piscine streptococcosis. In human health, it's a main cause, if not the main cause, of sepsis in young children, in neonates. And this came to the fore since the 1960s. It also causes infections in the mothers around the peripartum. Otherwise, GBS has become an increasingly common cause of sepsis in older adults since the last 30 years or so, but not healthy older adults, only older adults with comorbidities such as diabetes mellitus. Okay, so I want to emphasize this. It's older adults with comorbidities, not healthy adults. This is important because what I'm talking about today is totally different. It's new. In 2015 in Singapore, we had the only foodborne outbreak of invasive group B strep. It was the first time this had happened, the first time it had been reported, with a hypervirulent strain. Now, this outbreak was associated with the consumption of raw river fish. The strain was capsule type 3, sequence type 283, which is part of the clonal complex 283, and whole genome sequencing showed it was clonal. Now, we call this a hypervirulent strain because it affected younger people than normal, and it affected people with fewer comorbidities. On the previous slide, I told you that group B strep normally attacks older adults with comorbidities, but in this outbreak, it affected people without comorbidities. So let me explain this data to you. This table shows a comorbidity score, the Charleston comorbidity score. Somebody with a score of 0 is perfectly well. They might be older, but they're otherwise perfectly well. The higher the comorbidity score, the more comorbidities the person has. So here I have data for bacteremia, for sequence type 283, and for all other group B streps. And you'll notice that 85% of bacteremias due to the other group B streps occurred in people with 3 or more comorbidities. Only 2% of these bacteremias occurred in people with 0 comorbidities. So these are the group B streps. Very few of them attack healthy people, healthy adults. In contrast, if we look at ST283, 22% of bacteremias were in people without any comorbidities at all. So this is a striking difference. What was Singapore's response? Well, the officials sent out an advisory telling everybody to avoid yu sheng. Yu sheng is a raw freshwater fish dish. Shown in this picture here, you see the raw fish here, and people often have it with their porridge. Why did they do this? They did this because they had done a case control study. This showed a very strong association between having sequence type 283 and exposure to yu sheng. So it all added up. I just want to emphasize that we have no data implicating saltwater fish. So this is about raw freshwater fish. This is the outbreak curve from 2015 in Singapore. The number of cases on the y-axis, and on the x-axis the number of weeks. So all GBS bacteremia are shown here in these big bars. The outbreak organism is this black line shooting up in June and July until the advisory came out and there was public awareness. People stopped eating and the number of cases dropped fantastically. Around this time, a new ban was put in place, new legislation which banned the sale of ready-to-eat raw freshwater fish. And this seemed to work quite well. So at the time in 2015, we reviewed all the global data on the kernel complex 283. So let me lead you through this. Let's start over here. All the data from outside Southeast Asia can be summarized on these two lines. There was one report from France of 2 human cases of bone infection, and a report from Australia and New Zealand of 3 isolates of GBS, but we don't know any epidemiology about them. So those 5 isolates of ST283 represents the whole of the global data on ST283 outside Southeast Asia. It's almost non-existent. And this is interesting because there was lots of sequence type data for GBS outside Southeast Asia, so the absence is reliable. Now let's look at Southeast Asia. So Singapore's down here, and this smiley face represents all the cases we had in our outbreak. At that time, the only other report from humans in Southeast Asia was from Hong Kong, where they had reported 20 invasive cases and 4 carriage cases. This was published in 2006. In the animal literature, there was 1 report with 2 fish in it, 1 tilapia from Thailand, 1 tilapia from Vietnam, and from these 2 fish, the authors had isolated clonal complex 283, group B strep. So there's very little in Southeast Asia, but the data is unreliable because there had been very little sequence typing. So this is why I put here, in Southeast Asia, very little ST data, so the absence is unreliable. So my interpretation, based on this outbreak in Singapore, the cases in Hong Kong, and 1 or 2 fish here, my interpretation was that there was a regional problem. So the next slide shows you what we have found in the few years after that. So outside Southeast Asia, let's start here. In addition to the cases from France, Australia, New Zealand, in the rest of the global literature, writing to people, asking people for information, all we found was 1 case in the UK, 1 in the USA, and 1 in the Netherlands. That's it for the rest of the world. Vanishingly rare, and none of them had any epidemiological data. Interestingly, a report came out in 2016 describing outbreaks of ST283 in tilapia in Brazil, and I'll talk to you more about that in a moment. So let's come back to Southeast Asia. Well, we had the human cases here with the smiley face. We had the Hong Kong cases already mentioned with the smiley face. We found cases in Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Vietnam. In fact, in every single collection we looked at, we found ST283. Apart from Malaysia, the human cases from Malaysia, there are very few data from Malaysia, so I don't think that's representative, but we haven't seen ST283 in human GBS from Malaysia. Now let's talk about the tilapia. Well, in every farm we looked at, and also other people looked at, so this represents other people's work as well, ST283 accounts for a large proportion of all the GBS across Thailand, down the peninsula, into Malaysia, and also in Vietnam. We haven't looked in Cambodia, we haven't looked in the fish in Laos, so we don't know what's going on there. So this leads us to interpret the clonal complex 283 is heavily represented in every invasive GBS collection in fish and humans that we have looked at in Southeast Asia, apart from the humans in Malaysia. So this is nothing to do with group B strep, but it emphasizes that a lot of people eat raw fish, because this is from 2017. Look at this, people in Thailand, children being taught the risks of eating raw fish because of flukes. And in some communities, up to 80% of people have flukes. That means up to 80% are eating raw fish. So I'm just putting that here to emphasize a lot of people do eat raw fish. And this is a talk I went to in Thailand discussing traditional food items not recommended to eat because they contain raw fish. And these food items are not just in Thailand, they're in Laos and they're in Cambodia, maybe in Vietnam, I'm not sure. So this is the Brazilian data. In 2016, there was a report describing outbreaks in 6 tilapia farms in northeastern Brazil. There was high mortality, so this is economic loss for the farmers. And it was ST283. And they say that it came to Brazil with live tilapia imported from Singapore in 2014. But there's no record of this in Singapore, and we challenged them, and their answer was a farmer had told them. So we're not sure about that, but we're pretty sure it came from somewhere in Southeast Asia. Now this is the same MLST data, but it's showing you kernel complex 283 as a proportion of all GBS by country over time. This time component is important. So here we have from 1975 up till more recently. Up here we have human, and down below we have animal. The blue bars are collections where we found kernel complex 283. The green bars, we did not find CC283. So let's start with this green bar representing over 4,000 isolates from Africa, China, Europe, North and South America. There was 0 CC283. Amazing. Let's look at the animal side. These cattle isolates, bovine GBS, from Africa, China, Europe, North and South America, 0 CC283 found of over 1,300 isolates tested. More recently, they started looking at fish. There was 0 CC283 from 97 tested from several nations listed over here, but Southeast Asia is not included. So you'll notice all these green ones where they did not find CC283 do not include any isolates from Southeast Asia, because Southeast Asia had not been sampled. So our response was to sample. So we wrote around, and this is the detail of what I showed you on the previous slide. I will just read out the percentages. So we found in Singapore, depending on the time period, it's between 6 and 36% of all our invasive GBS are the outbreak organism. In Hong Kong, it's 11% over this long time period. Vietnam, 31%. Laos and Thailand, 76 and 73% of all their invasive group B streps over this long time period were clonal complex 283. Let's look at the fish. We'll look at this data from Thailand, the best bit we have here. 30% from farms all over Thailand, north, south, east, central, west and south, 30-odd% were clonal complex 283. There was even a frog in China with a very closely related sequence type 739, but it's part of the complex 283. It was farmed for human consumption. There's this collection from Vietnam, 100% of those invasive GBS were CC283. The collection from Malaysia back in 2007 and in 2018, 100% of these invasive GBS in tilapia were CC283. This data is interesting from Singapore. This was during the outbreak year, 2015. The authorities sampled fish imported at the ports. They found CC283 in 1% of samples. But when they sampled fish in the markets, which includes sliced fish, 30% were positive. Now we assume this increase is due to cross-contamination during handling. But from the consumer's perspective, it's the pieces of fish they buy which are important. So this 30% is relevant. So I just want to point out that there were earlier reports of adult onset group B strep septic arthritis, but there was no sequence typing done. And this stretched back to the 1990s. And this kind of illness is very unusual in healthy adults. And a lot of these adults were healthy. They had no comorbidities. So we're suspicious that this unusual series of cases was partly due to clonal complex 283, but we don't know. How about the burden of GBS sepsis? We don't have good data. We have too little data, but we do have some from Nakhon Phanom province in Thailand, and their rates over 3 years are approximately 3-fold higher than this comparator from the UK. I use the UK because the data is available. Otherwise, there's very little data on this. The whole excess in Thailand was due to clonal complex 283. So our interpretation is, certainly for Laos and Thailand, that GBS is primarily a foodborne infection, which is astonishing. And we think it's associated with aquaculture. We did not measure or study transmission, but this is what we think. We also think that 283 is a food safety concern across Southeast Asia because a lot of people eat raw fish products. And we also think that tilapia farms are at risk, and we say globally, because of the data from Brazil. But tilapia are grown in Africa and other countries as well. So what's happened since 2015? Well, we've had several networking events, One Health events, And we're currently in the middle of a UN FAO risk profile exercise, which hopefully will be finished in the next month. Otherwise, there's very little extra data coming in. There is a little bit from Singapore, which I'll tell you about. So this is data from my hospital showing ST283 in orange and other GBS in blue. So let's look at the more recent data. We had the outbreak in 2015, and despite the ban, we continue to have some cases, but less than 10 for each year for the last 3 years. And then this is what happened in July 2020, just 2 or 3 months ago. We had 18 cases in 1 month. Fantastic. Fantastically interesting. So let's think about these cases. We can assume they were acquired in Singapore because of the coronavirus travel restrictions. That's interesting. Did they get it from raw tilapia? Maybe they had a post-lockdown celebration with their favorite food? I don't know. This was denied by patients when the Ministry of Health did an investigation, but they would deny it because it's illegal. So we don't know where they caught this from, which is a shame. What we do know is there's an ongoing reservoir because they got it from somewhere. So there's an ongoing threat. And if we're having cases like this in Singapore, we assume, if it's coming from imported tilapia, we assume there's ongoing illness elsewhere in Southeast Asia. And that's what we're worried about. So I'd like to acknowledge a lot of people, and just mention Masami from FAO, who invited me, so thank you, Masami. A lot of our data is written up in this neglected tropical diseases journal, because nobody else believed us. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. And thank you all speakers, Fatima and Tim, and of course, Masami. So what we heard just after the break over the last 45 minutes or so are essentially the way science is done to support food safety. So what these cases reflect and what we actually wanted to convey through our very good speakers that we had today was to actually show the level of research and analysis that actually goes behind identifying many of these hazards, and in some cases even trying to scan the horizon and look at emerging hazards, and then see how they could actually be brought into the food safety domain and implemented through good practices and standards. So these are, this is just to give you a flavor. There are obviously lots of issues that we need to discuss more, but we can only do so much in this particular forum. But this is a conversation and this will continue. So at this point, we would just like to open this up for general discussion between all the 5 speakers. So first of all, let me thank Bob and Delia for staying online since coming on in the morning. And also again to the 3 other speakers, Masami, Fatima, and Tim. So let me first go back first to Bob and then to Delia. So a couple of things here, Bob, that you would have seen and also which has been brought out by the speakers on data and analysis and then how it relates to practice. So as a major company in the food sector, you do handle huge volumes of raw produce. And obviously you source it from a number of actors in the chain and producers. So what are the kind of measures you have in place to ensure that the entry points for hazards are minimized during the production and then along the chain? Over to you, Bob.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so if you think about it, you know, all this starts, we have a program in place called our Material Quality Management Program, and it's the standard that we apply globally. And it's really I guess the way that we move forward as part of our supplier quality assurance group. And it really starts with doing in-depth risk assessments on each of the materials that we use within our factories, which we use throughout the world. And we actually go and we look at what's available in literature, what's available through our experience, but also what's available through our network of collaborators to build our risk assessments. And from those risk assessments, we then build our specs, And then from our specs, we then use that to execute our audits, working with our suppliers, and also understanding, how those risks are actually hazards are being managed across our supply chain. One thing that can't be underestimated is building relationships with your supply base. So, what we tend to do is rather than have many small suppliers, we tend to work with suppliers that, larger suppliers that can meet our needs, and allow us to really focus in on how we manage those risks, either be it locally, be it regionally, be it globally. So it's really all part of our SQA, supplier quality assurance team, to build those relationships along with our procurement teams, then to work to really to see how our suppliers meet our specs in terms of testing, in terms of data. We really want to manage the risks as far up the supply chain as possible, working with our suppliers, but then doing verification, testing, audits, what have you, at our front gates. Tends to be done at a much lower level because in theory, we feel that by having these relationships, having the right standards, having the right programs, most of that's being managed further up, but using front gate testing as verification. Hopefully that helps.
Point where you actually talked about the importance of actually having relationships or build relationships with suppliers and especially producers, actors along the chain. I mean, essentially, then this becomes what you would call a relationship of trust and confidence. And so here's where then, Bob, then do you all advocate strongly for the PRPs that we have been talking about across them? And are you doing this directly, or are you doing it through a network of, let's say, farmers organizations or involving others to deliver this message? Over to you, Bob.
Yeah, it's all of the above. Once again, we build the relationships through our teams, but we work closely with a number of different groups. As I mentioned before, the likes of GFSI, and really working with them and some third-party groups that will actually help with some of our audits, looking in terms of our supply chains. So if you think about it on a global basis, it's quite a big task. So we do work with a number of different groups to help accomplish what we need through collaborations, but also through partnerships, and that's a big piece of it.
Thank you, Bob. So then this actually brings to some of the issues that the subsequent scientific presentations actually raised. And so Delia, here I would like to come to you and ask, since you did actually give us that very interesting analysis that what even the experts are identifying as hazards are probably not as risky to people's health as we think they are. But there is a lot of emphasis on monitoring programs. So on pesticide monitoring, veterinary drug residue monitoring, market surveys, food basket surveys, and so on. So how do you see if these methods could be used in a more targeted way to actually ensure that people are better off with better access to safer food? Over to you, Delia.
Yes, thank you. We do see monitoring for sure. And again, the richer the country, the more monitoring that happens. But what we tend to see is and I think this came up from Tim's presentation, is it's very unsystematic. So it's just these kind of, one-off surveys here and there. We did an analysis for one Southeast Asian country, and it was basically, it was triggered. If someone felt there was a problem, they would go and monitor, and then they would go away again. So we're not really, with the few exceptions, as mentioned, like of the global flu, they're now, the WHO is trying to set up systematic monitoring for AMR, antimicrobial resistant bacteria. But outside in LMICs, we do not see any systematic monitoring. And the monitoring we do see is often of a very basic kind. So, you know, it's looking at the knowns, it's not looking at the unknowns. And I think that's one of the risks with things like COVIDs or these, you know, emerging. Over the past decades, we've seen so many emerging foodborne diseases, many of them linked with the way we have shifted our food systems, especially intensive agriculture, and we're not very well adapted to picking up new things. And again, that's where One Health can come in and joined up systems of surveillance and monitoring. So yeah, the other thing, of course, is risk targeting. To what extent we can use epidemiology to target hotspots where things are most likely to go wrong. And we do have some data on what we call drivers of emergence. And they're often things like spillover opportunities between wildlife and intensified agriculture, but also just certain parts of the, you know, ecosystems which are more likely to lead to emergence. And I think rather than, a quick anecdote, in Mozambique, they have about 20 formal retailers, and they have about 10 food inspectors. And I asked them, and so again, 90% of food is sold in the informal sector. So I asked them, who are you monitoring and inspecting? And they said, we're monitoring the 10 formal industries. And I said, you know, but, you know, 90% of it is informal. And they said, yes, but the formal ones are the ones which it's easy to monitor. So that creates challenges when you're trying to improve domestic food safety. Over.
Indeed, thank you, Delia. I mean, essentially, it's something that when you want to search for something you've lost, but you do it in the lighted area and don't do it in a dark area. So that's indeed very well put. So here's where then the question comes to Masami. From what we've heard, both from, and also what Delia mentioned and Tim mentioned, is that sometimes a little knowledge is also a dangerous thing. So how much data is enough, or what, or if we don't have enough, how do we go about it in terms of food safety?
Thank you very much for the excellent question. It is a very key point that I wanted to talk more actually in the presentation, that I did mention in my presentation that sometimes some data are better than nothing, but then there is a danger, as you say, that very incomplete data may mislead people to too early misconclusion. So this is something that we have to really remember. And then I would really ask the panelists, all of you, that I think that you would confirm that there is no like perfect set of data to make a conclusion. I mean, there's no case that I have found that international risk assessment that FAO conducts, there's no situation that, yes, we have a perfect data set and then we can make a really good conclusion. Here is the risk management option that we have to do, and then end of the story. This doesn't happen. Usually that there is always certain level of uncertainties and then some level of lack of data. We cannot cover entire geographical coverage of the world, and we still have all those problem of this lack of data in certain places or certain areas. I think that my friend Tim will be able to explain further on the topic that he has been talking about in terms of this missing data. What do we do about this situation that we don't have a data? So may I give the microphone over to Tim so that he can further explain? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Masami. Well, our data was opportunistic data, as Delia Grace just mentioned. We wrote to lots of people and said, do you have any GBS in your freezers? And we were lucky that some people did. So, but like a jigsaw, you have little pieces, and if there are nice bits of data, you know where on the jigsaw to put it, and it fits in, and you begin to build an image. And as you say, you don't need all the pieces to know what the picture is going to be on your jigsaw. So you don't need all the data to come to a very sensible conclusion about what's going on. But of course, if you have a piece of data where you're not sure where on the jigsaw it goes, you might put it in the wrong place and be misled, just as you explained. So I agree with that. So for us, the awful thing is I don't live in all these countries in Southeast Asia. I only live in Singapore. So I would love to go around and I would like to find people, but really it's for the people who live in these countries to decide whether they think this data is convincing to them. And really what I'd love to see is people in these countries go out and actually have a look at the data and generate some data so we can really see whether it's a real problem. Because I see it, the GBS ST283 is a very interesting thing. Medically, it's supremely interesting. We just don't see invasive disease in healthy adults like this with any other group B strep. So it's very interesting for us. How important it is as a foodborne illness, well, I imagine it's important, but really it needs to be measured a little bit more. I can talk forever. You have to tell me what you want me to talk about. I could just mention the antimicrobial resistance that Delia Grace just mentioned, that people want everybody to measure that. One of the problems we have around Asia is that people don't value laboratory tests. So they see it as an extra expense. So when they go, a sick person sees their doctor, they don't want to have a test done. When I came here 20 years ago, I couldn't even persuade our local infection doctors that they needed to have 2 to 4 bottles for blood cultures. They only wanted to pay for one. Now they're doing 4 to 6 bottles because they realize over time how important it is. But this means that if you look at resistance data in many hospitals in Asia, it reflects samples taken a week or 2 or 3 weeks after admission. It doesn't reflect the organisms that they came into the hospital with. So you tend to see very high resistance rates. And so the data is slightly polluted by the fact that they don't take those precious samples when the patients first come in. They try to treat them without the investigations because it's cheaper. Does that make sense, Delia?
Absolutely, and I must say that in many places I work, 80% of people and animals never go to a qualified doctor hospital at all. The treatment is just that, tablets sold literally on the sidewalk out of sweetie bottles, and people just go and buy ampicillin, and it's only once they've tried 3 or 4 different things, then they may think about going to first a quack or a pharmacist. The pharmacist probably is not a trained pharmacist. It's his son or someone he's employing who never got any training, and then eventually they may make their way to the hospital. So it's a long way from community illness to actually any tests being done.
And that pollutes the data, doesn't it? Because it means that the data we get is for more hospital-acquired or healthcare-associated infections. It's not really representing what's going on in the community.
And often after there have been multiple attempts to cure things in the community, which also is going to change people's, microbial flora and fauna.
Thank you. Indeed, I mean, that is, this is an interesting conversation, and often in food safety, particularly in the issue of labs, the issue of sampling comes along, that how do you actually sample to ensure that you actually get some balanced data and analysis out of it rather than something which is skewed. And that's the source of the headlines in many countries in Asia and the Pacific region on various food safety issues. So that's something for us to keep in mind. So here, Dr. Patima, if you can just come to you, there are actually a couple of questions specifically for you on the chat, and particularly on the Clostridium species that you've actually spoken about. So which is the one which is most implicated for food poisoning, and where are they usually found? And also if they're associated with canned food, is one question that is here. And there's also another one on how do you actually block the germination? So maybe you could just elaborate on this. I'm sure you've spoken about it in the presentation.
Mm-hmm. So let me repeat your question. First, you talk about the food poisoning, right? For the food poisoning point of view, as we know that Clostridium botulinum can produce a highly toxic neurotoxin, but I believe that in the commercial, like the canned food industry, that problem is very minimal. There's of course still some problem from the maybe some the home canned food producing, especially for the low acid canned food. But from in other point of view, for the food poisoning, Clostridium perfringens has a lot higher number of the cases. Even I mean in many countries, maybe one of the thing because it has a very short generation time. So once it contaminate in the food because it was spread in the environment. So once it contaminate in the food and that food has been stored at the improper temperature, it can like increase in the cell number like very rapidly to reach the infection dose. So I think that's my first answer. And the second answer, how to block germination, right? In fact, there are many compounds that has been studied, try to identify to block the germination, even in a food preservative, like I showed the chitosan one, or in the term of disinfection. But the problem is somehow that like I mentioned in case of food, that if it already like increased in the cell number already, so that might not be helpful. And especially when many compound that when it tests on the like the suspension test, like the laboratory media, it works very well once it incorporate in the real food system, which is much more complex, like has a lot of nutrient or a lot of things that can work as a cushion for the bacterial endospore. So the efficacy is really less. So still there are a lot of things that has to learn about that in the future research or the use of hurdle technology. This is a combination of milder treatment, but like you have many tools that you can, okay, this blocked by this mechanism, this blocked by the other mechanism that could work well too. And it's actually still in the work that undergoing on.
Thank you, Dr. Pratima, for that good explanation. So if I can go back to Bob now, let's go to the other one of the work that you actually do very actively, and that is of partnerships. So you did speak extensively about some of the analytical capability of Mars and how you actually then partner. Could you just talk us a little bit about your partnership with organizations, including FAO, on training and capacity building, particularly in laboratory analytical services, and how that has worked out? Over to you.
Yeah, so very good question, and thank you for that. Yeah, we've established some very close collaborations and partnerships with the likes of FAO and also with the World Food Program in particular, and we've seen these as very enlightening, I think, on both parts, but also very mutual. And then when we go into partnerships, we want to make sure that there's areas of mutual interest, but also mutual benefit going into it. So, we've done a number of joint training operations with both FAO and also with WFP, and some in particular in the area of mycotoxins. And actually have done some missions with FAO and the likes of Tanzania, and also working with the World Food Program in the areas of mycotoxins as well, and in terms of sampling, in terms of testing, and also in terms of how to work with suppliers and those fronts. So we've seen those as being where there's been excellent exchange of information, excellent learnings on both parts, but also we see it as making a difference. Right now, we've been actually working on a a program looking at a modeling system, and this is a predictive model for aflatoxin prediction. And it's work that we've actually done with Cambridge University, and are working to share that and working with FAO on that as well. So we see that as an area that we've just kicked this off, as part of the Hand in Hand initiative, and we see that as something that we're excited to see where it goes. So anyway, just some examples of where we see this going. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you for highlighting the Hand in Hand, which is one of FAO's flagship initiatives globally at this point. So, Delia, one question to you, because Bob did bring about, talk about the question of, working with a number of the smallholders, producers. So, and he did mention some of the countries where, for instance, aflatoxins are a major problem. So, instead of trying to, and usually the response would be to, let's set up a laboratory which can analyze aflatoxins and, investments and so on. So how would you, balance this? That should we go about for more, direct contact with the farmers, smallholders, producer organizations, increase awareness along the chain, and maybe do a bit of lab analysis, or, do more of, set up a monitoring program? It's a bit related to the previous question, but it's a question of how do we make sure that we achieve the best result possible for such an issue?
Well, I think that I'm going to be a contrarian now. I think this takes us back to prioritization. So when we look at the actual health impacts of aflatoxin, and our best knowledge, as I said, comes from the WHO, they're much less than 1% of the foodborne disease, whereas other diseases like norovirus or salmonellosis or lead are orders of magnitude larger. So aflatoxins, they are charismatic and publicity rich. They get a lot of attention, but remember, we are very poor intuitive judges of risk. And what we worry about and what makes us sick and kills us is not the same. So my first thought would be to say, do we need better education on the difference between hazards and risks? We did one study in Kenya where the standards for aflatoxin is 10 parts per billion. And if these standards were to be strictly enforced, Kenya would have to destroy 40% of its maize every year, and maize is the staple food in Kenya, and so that really would not be a very sensible thing to do. In terms of monitoring, it's hard to get as I said, international World Food Programme, international companies tend to do this a little bit better. I'm not going to name the country, but they set up quite a good, strong monitoring program with help from an American university. Two things. What the farmer said is, if one company, miller, refuses us, we just keep driving down the road. And of course, sampling for aflatoxins, they're very heterogeneously distributed among maize. So they just keep driving down the road until they find a miller who will accept them. And then the aflatoxins go straight into the food chain. And the other thing is, when they have a really bad year, even the good millers say, it's over the limits, but we buy it. What can we do? If we refuse to buy food, we can't make flour, and if we can't make flour, we lose money, and then we go bankrupt, and then everybody is very unhappy. So it's not just as straightforward as setting up monitoring and strictly enforcing standards in low and middle income countries. I think we need to go closer to the source, try and improve it on farm, try and get more third party monitoring, try and get the consumers more involved, and not focus too much. If you've got 15 parts per million aflatoxin, you're going to get maybe another 10 or 20 deaths. in a country the size of Tanzania, and every day hundreds of people are killed on the road in matatus. So, you know, there has to be some sort of balance between the actual risk in terms of public health, the cost of dealing with the problem, and the other things you could spend your money on, maybe you know, child care, neonatal sepsis. And we don't see that. We just see knee-jerk reactions and people, you know, seeing something in the newspaper and then bringing in regulations. That's why we need to delegate, participate. It's not about just regulating. Sorry to be complicated. Thank you.
Can I just say something there?
Yes, Tim, please, yes.
I only went to Vietnam for the first time in my life about 2 years ago. I went to go and to talk about antimicrobial resistance. And I was walking along the road and it was just full of people, just so many people. And I looked around and I thought, this isn't an issue. It's not on their minds. They don't care. They have more important things to worry about. So I think what Delia just said is spot on.
Yes, I was thinking I cannot agree more to Delia that all the points that she is making is really, I really had to nod really deeply, particularly that I would like to emphasize that the point that she was making, the difference between hazard and risk, that I have been repeating this over and over and over. And then I think that what she's suggesting, this educational campaign, and then also to use this data to do this risk-based prioritization. This is something that I think the region can really take it up and then really do better in the food safety management. So thank you very much, all the panelists, for the very nice discussion that I myself learned a lot from all of your presentations. So thank you very much. And with this, that we have few minutes left, so I would like to inform you about day 3, which is the next Tuesday. And then next Tuesday, we will be focusing on the topics like standards and trade, and then also the industry, and then also some farmers, different stakeholders that we would like to have a spotlight on. And then we would like to further discuss that how we can improve the food safety situation in the region and then also at the global level. And the same registration link will work. And so please come back and then enjoy and then join our conversation by Q&A box. And then I have seen so many questions and then so many comments in the chat box and then also the Q&A box. So we will pick up the questions and then we will continue the discussion on Tuesday next week. And then last but then not least, we have one more interesting video. We have so many people from Lao PDR, and then we have a video coming from the Lao high-level officials. So with that, I will say that goodbye to everyone and then see you on Tuesday next week. Thank you very much, all the panelists, for your time and then valuable inputs. Bye-bye.
Food safety is one of the main priorities of Lao PDR as the production system are evolving since the country economic reform in the 1980s. As you may know, Lao PDR is predominantly an agriculture country. The majority of farmers and smallholders who follow traditional farming practice which are organic by default. However, it is gradually changing with increasing demand as well as opening of new markets. Food safety has been in focus in the country for the last 2 decades. We have introduced the concept of sustainable green and green production system at all levels. This focus on introduction of organic agriculture following good agriculture practice, pesticide-free production and integrated pest management. Our government have introduced a number of law and policy framework for food safety. This includes the 2004 Law on Food, Law on Consumer Production, and the 1998 Law on Agriculture. The main policy framework include the following: the 2019 National Green Growth Strategy, the 2016 Strategy Plan for National Organic Agriculture Development, as well as the National Socioeconomic Development Plan. We have law and policy in place for food safety, yet we also need FAO help in translating them into action. We need support in capacity building for farmers to implement safe food production system, as well as of the government officials to enforce this standard. In the past few years, the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry, with active support from FAO, has developed and enacted a pesticide decree. We are promoting the concept of green rice landscape. This is not only for food safety but also the conservation around the agro-biodiversity of the rice field. Together, FAO and Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry have developed the Green and Sustainable Agriculture Strategic Framework and the Green Agriculture Strategic Program. We have worked on integrated pest management that have made significant contribution to food safety in recent years. As efforts to ensure food safety in the Lao PDR continue to improve, we look forward to FAO continued support.